Good afternoon. My name is Gail Agrawal, and as Dean of the Iowa College of Law, I am delighted to welcome you to this important conference. For the next several hours, a group of very distinguished speakers will address one of the most vexing problems of our time. How will the United States solve the problem of its national debt? We can expect to be informed and challenged by today's program. So I offer a special welcome to our speakers, who will be introduced properly in a few minutes. We are also honored to be joined by Regent Bob Downer and his wife Jane, by our Provost, Barry Butler, by President Emeritus and Professor of Law, Sandy Boyd, so many of my faculty colleagues from the Colleges of Law and Business. And we are always especially gratified by the presence of our students on a pretty Saturday afternoon. So thank you all for joining us. I extend our sincere thanks to the Bradley Foundation and to the Federalist Society for the financial support that made this conference a reality, and to our co-sponsor, the University of Iowa Lecture Committee. We are also grateful to Dean Sarah Gordial and the Tippie College of Business for making this wonderful space available to us. I want to acknowledge the hard work of so many people in the College of Law in planning for this day. Jill DeYoung and Janie Pearsall, who handled the logistics, and as they always do, made it look so easy. The law students who worked on the conference and served as liaisons to our speakers, they're doing a great job. And especially to my faculty colleagues and the conference co-conveners, Professor Robert Miller, who joined our faculty this year as the Dom Fellow in Corporate Law, and who has already enriched the life of the College of Law in so many ways. And to Professor Mark O'Seal, who will shortly have the honor of formally introducing our speakers. My last job, though, is to say a few words of introduction about Professor O'Seal. He joined our faculty in 1994 and was named the Aliber Family Chair in Law in 2008. He earned his bachelor's degree at the University of California, Berkeley, his master's from the University of Chicago, a law degree, and a PhD from Harvard. In his early career, he was a judicial law clerk on the United States Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit, and he practiced law with a large private firm in Boston. He began his academic career at the Tulane School of Law, and he served as a visiting fellow at Cambridge University, Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, the London School of Economics, and the American Bar Foundation Northwestern. He's been a visiting professor at a number of law schools in the United States and internationally. Professor O'Seal is a prolific and insightful scholar. He's published 7 books, a large number of book chapters, an impressive list of articles in the leading law reviews and in peer-reviewed journals. If I read them all, would be here most of the afternoon. Much of his work has examined legal responses to mass atrocity, and in his more recent work, he's looked at the role of lawyers in an emerging global economy. He's a frequent speaker to national and international organizations and a regular media commentator. So now join me in welcoming Professor O'Seal to introduce our speakers and start our program.
Thank you, Gail, for that embarrassingly generous introduction. Let me welcome you all, as has Dean Agrawal, to today's symposium on fiscal reform, monetization, or default. For their co-sponsorship, Professor Robert Miller and I are very grateful to the College of Law and to its Student Federalist Society. The Lynd and Harry Bradley Foundation has generously provided the resources to make all this possible. We're very grateful to the foundation, and particularly to Thomas Smallwood, one of its directors, and an Iowa Law School alum. Let me now describe our speakers briefly. Alan Meltzer is the Alan Meltzer Professor of Political Economy at Carnegie Mellon University. He has written for over 50 years on the history of U.S. monetary policy, on the size of government, the international financial system. He's the founder and chairman of Shadow Open Market Committee and has served as a consultant on economic policy for Congress, the Treasury Department, the Federal Reserve, the World Bank, and various foreign governments. He is the author, most recently, of the magisterial 3-volume History of the Federal Reserve. He earned his AB and MA at Duke University and his PhD from the University of California, Los Angeles. Our second speaker is Dennis Lockhart. He's the president and chief executive officer of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta and serves on the Federal Reserve's Federal Open Market Committee. He taught at Georgetown and Johns Hopkins University and was chairman of the Small Enterprise Assistance Funds, a managing partner at the private equity firm Zephyr Management, and was president of Heller's Financial Heller International Group. He earned his BA in political science and economics from Stanford and his MA in international economics and American foreign policy from Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced Studies. Stephen Schwartz, our third speaker, is the Stanley A. Starr Professor of Law and Business at Duke University and the founding director of Duke's Interdisciplinary Global Capital Markets Center. His areas of research include international finance, capital markets, systemic risk, and commercial law. Prior to joining the Duke faculty, he was a partner at 2 leading international law firms, where he represented top banks and other financial institutions in structuring innovative capital market financing transactions. He helped to pioneer the field of asset securitization, and his book, Structured Finance, is one of the most widely used texts in the field. Professor Schwartz has been the Leverhulme Visiting Professor at Oxford University, Visiting Professor at the University of Geneva Faculty of Law, and Senior Fellow at the University of Melbourne Law School. Professor Schwartz has written perhaps the most widely cited and highly esteemed article on the origins of and possible regulatory solutions to our financial crisis, an article called Systemic Risk, available online. Charles Himmelberg, our final speaker, is head of global credit strategy at Goldman Sachs and Company. Prior to joining Goldman Sachs, he worked for the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and taught at Columbia University, NYU, and the University of Chicago. He's been a consultant to the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago and to the World Bank, and is a member of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York's Financial Advisory Committee. His research includes macroeconomics, corporate finance, asset pricing, and housing economics. He earned his BS from the University of Kansas and his PhD from Northwestern. Our format will be that after our 2 presentations, the first 2 in this session, we'll let each speaker respond to the other and then open the floor for questions. Please join me now in welcoming our speakers today. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm very happy to be here at the University of Iowa. I came close to starting my academic career here, but didn't. The subject today is how will the United States solve the problem of the national debt. I'm not going to ignore that topic, but I am going to talk about something which I believe importantly precedes it. And that is because I believe that solving the national debt problem is in part a problem of getting our economy growing again so that it can prosper and provide the revenue, some of the revenues needed to solve that problem. I'm going to talk about why we have a flawed recovery, why this recovery, by any standard you can imagine, is the slowest recovery we've ever experienced. Slower than the recovery from the Great Depression, slower than the recovery from the dismal, devastating 1937-38 recession, slower than any recovery in the post-war years. So it's important to ask, why is it so slow? And the simple answer is because we're doing all the wrong things. There are people, you can read Paul Krugman, who's certainly an advocate of that in the New York Times, as an advocate of the idea that we just need to spend money. And if we just spend enough, never knowing how much is enough, that things will get better. I believe that if it was ever true, it's certainly not true anymore. And that for several reasons. Mainly because it matters what you spend on. The productivity of the resources that you employ by your spending should be greater than what would happen otherwise. Otherwise, you don't go forward, you go backward. Second, we live in an age of great uncertainty, which is made manifestly worse by the policies of the government. This is not a political criticism of this particular administration. It would be similar if almost any other administration, more severe in this case than in others, but symptomatic of the way in which governments operate. Every day, practically, the president says, I want to raise your tax rates if you're making more than $250,000. How does that sit with the people who have to pay those taxes? Does it encourage them to go out and invest and spend? Or does it encourage them to say, well, you know, let's sit on the cash and wait and see, there'll probably be a better day? That's what they seem to be doing. Corporations have built up their balance sheets, have enormous hoards of cash, and don't spend very much for investment. And when they do spend for investment, they don't invest in things, for the most part, which require hiring more labor. Quite the opposite. They invest in computer programs and robotics. The university, which I spend most of my time, Carnegie Mellon, is very big in robotics, so we're very conscious of the amount that's going into robotics, and robotics have become very important. If you're in a manufacturing industry, you don't want to hire labor. You don't want to hire labor because, in part, the health care bill tells you hiring labor is going to have a large health care cost. So companies ranging from the food industry to the manufacturing industries, wherever they can, are trying to reduce the amount of labor and substitute capital and productivity. That's one of the reasons why in this age of uncertainty, we're uncertain about labor costs. Businessmen are uncertain about what the National Labor Relations Board is going to do to them in the future. It has plans of all kinds of how to strengthen the power of labor unions and weaken the power of the opposition to labor unions. That isn't exactly the way in which it may be a good thing to do, it may be a bad thing to do, but it isn't the way in which you encourage businessmen to invest more. So we have that. Then we have, in addition to that, the Environmental Protection Agency. It may be a very good thing or a very not so good thing to do some of the things that the Environmental Protection Agency wants, but they're costly. And they're costly on the companies which are going to have to do them. And so you add together all these costs and the uncertainty about them, and you get the makings of a slow recovery. Now, that leads me to the second part of what we do. That's the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve has a cockeyed policy from the get-go. They were magnificent. They were magnificent in handling the crisis of 2008. They did basically the right things. They prevented a collapse of the financial system, and that is very much to the good. But since that time, that's where my praise for their activity ends. All this uncertainty tells us that I talked about tax rates, about health care costs, about labor costs, about environmental costs. All those are real problems. Economists since the get-go learned that you have to distinguish between monetary problems, things which have to do with too much money or too low interest rates, and real problems being things like the uncertainty that we have or we can add to that the fact that one of our major markets in Europe is is doing poorly, so exports, which would be about 20% of our exports, 20% of our exports are being held back by the slow growth in Europe. Those are real problems. There is nothing that the Federal Reserve can do about solving real problems. The Federal Reserve is authorized and enabled to solve monetary problems. Now, how can I be so certain that the Federal Reserve is doing things which are having very little effect, not none, but very little effect on the problems that the country has with employment and growth? Well, just look at what the outcome of what they do is. They pile up excess reserves. What are excess reserves? They're the amount of money that the Federal Reserve puts out that the banks hold and don't use. They pile up. So how much are they piled up? Well, a few $1 trillion. That's trillion with a TR, not a B. Trillions of dollars of excess reserves sitting idly. And what is the Federal Reserve doing? It's adding to the amount that sits idly. Now, I'll give you one example which summarizes a lot of this cost. In the summer of, I guess it was 2010, the Federal Reserve began what it called QE2. Quantitative easing is QE, and 2, because 1 was the good things they did at the time of the crisis. QE2 was about $600 billion. Where did that money go? $500 billion went into those excess reserves. It just sat idly. Now, when you see the excess reserves piling up, that should signal to you that there isn't a shortage of money, that there is plenty of money. The banks have trillions, literally trillions of dollars of reserves that they can use to expand loans if there was a demand for those loans, and if there were the risk and return elements on the loans were things that attracted them. They don't, and so the money sits pretty much idly. If you're General Electric or IBM or Apple, which doesn't need much money, you can borrow from the banks because they know you can repay them. But if you're a startup company, the things that we pride ourselves on being so good at doing, if you're a startup company, you're in a high-risk class. So very few, if any, banks want to take, at the current interest rates that the Fed is maintaining, wants to take those loans. You can read every day about the amount of mortgage loans that are being made and how the housing market is booming. But what's making it boom are primarily large companies going into the business of buying houses as an asset. It's not that you, as a young householder, or your mother and father, as buying perhaps their first house, that you can go to the bank and they'll give you a mortgage. The chances are they'll look at you and say, no, we don't want to lend to you because the risk-return relationship on the low interest rates that the Fed is maintaining just don't make it a good deal for us. So we're going to be pretty cautious about who we lend to. That's another sign that we're doing the wrong things, that the policies that we're following are not conducive to solving the problem. That's why this is the slowest recovery in modern history. It's because we're not doing the right things. Now, what would some of the right things be? Well, one of them is reduce tax rates. Everybody agrees that we have the highest corporate tax rate of any major country. That doesn't encourage people to invest in the United States. It encourages them to invest outside the United States. So we could close loopholes and cut the tax rate, except we can't agree politically to do that, so we're in a stalemate. Now, why do I say cutting the tax rate would be a good thing to do? Because it has worked repeatedly in our history. My friends who don't always agree with me say, well, you know, President Clinton raised tax rates on upper income groups, and the economy boomed. And it isn't just that Ronald Reagan reduced tax rates and the economy boomed, but President Clinton raised tax rates on upper income groups and the economy boomed. That's not right. It is true that he raised tax rates on the upper income groups, but he also balanced the budget. He's the only president since Eisenhower, since 1930, there have only been two presidents who have balanced the government's budget in back-to-back years. One was President Eisenhower, who I remember, but most of you don't. And he gave talks about fiscal responsibility and balanced budgets damn near every week. So you got the message. He believed in balanced budget and surpluses. President Clinton balanced the budget. Now, what does balancing the budget do? What it does is it tells people, look, your tax rates are not going to have to go up. They may go down. That's a good thing. That encourages them to spend more, to invest more, to build capital, because they know or they believe that when those projects are completed and online and producing income, the tax rate is not going to be much higher, it may be lower than what it is now. That encourages investment. When the president does the opposite and says, I'm going to raise your tax rates, it does the opposite. It discourages investment in the United States. And that's why investment has been so slow, in my opinion. That's why investment has been so slow. So we're doing the wrong things. Now, we have, in addition to all these things, we have a regulatory apparatus which is just awful. It's mostly command and control. There are, I'm told, more than 300 regulatory rules in the Dodd-Frank Financial Regulation Bill. There are at least as many in the health care bill. How, in the name of goodness, can anyone possibly think that a manager is going to be able to cope with 300 or more regulations and figure out what it does? And most of these regulations are goodwill things. They're telling you, command and control. This is what we want you to do. Go do it. I gave a talk years ago at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. The council is mostly financed by Wall Street firms, so the audience consisted of a lot of Wall Street people. Among the audience were lawyers who worked on Wall Street. When I talked about regulation, I said, regulation, the way we regulate, we get command and control regulation. And one of the things that happens is the people who are regulated find ways to circumvent it. So circumvention is a big thing. They adapt to stay within the rules of the regulation, but not quite meeting the objectives of the regulation. First person getting up in the question period said, I'm a lawyer, I work on Wall Street. Who do you think shows them how to do that circumvention? We do. Well, touche. But that tells us a lot about what goes on. Now, I'm not against regulation. Regulation, we have differences between private and social costs. So we recognize that we have to have regulations, but regulations, we want regulations which work. What kind of regulations work? Regulations which give the people who are regulated an incentive to do what you want them to do. We will, in very short order, see a bill, a bipartisan bill, that I have helped to work on, which will say, let's get rid of a lot of the Dodd-Frank regulations and replace them with something which will get bankers to behave better than they have. What would that be? Well, we'll just tell them, we're going to raise your required equity capital reserves. We're going to make you hold much more money in reserve, equity in reserve. Your stockholders are going to be responsible, much more responsible for the risks that you undertake, because they're going to go first against your equity. That puts their skin in the game, makes them think about prudence. Will it work? Well, you never know. But let me say this, that from 1929 to 1932, the worst banking period during the early years of the Great Depression, banks didn't have a lot of regulations, but they had 15 to 20, New York banks had 15 to 20% equity capital. Not a single one failed. Not only did they not fail, but when President Hoover wanted to start as a private organization, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, he went to the New York banks and he asked them each in 1932, in 1931, in the depth of the Depression, he asked each one of them to come up with $50 million to capitalize the company, which he called the National Credit Conference. They agreed to do it. They agreed to do it. So they had $50 million, a lot of money in 1931, to capitalize something. They were prudent. Prudence is what we need in the banking system. Now, the bankers will not like this proposal, and they will scream against it because they'll say, well, that's going to hurt lending. That, you shouldn't believe that. Lending will be the amount of money that the Federal Reserve supplies to the bankers to permit them to make loans. What it will do, that they won't say, but which will be true, is it will squeeze their profits. We now have a system in which they can go to the Federal Reserve and borrow at 1/4%, and they can buy government securities, which is what they do, and earn 1 to 2%. So they're making barrels of money on that exchange. That's your money, taxpayers' money, which they're using. That's a result of the mistaken policies of the Federal Reserve. So what would I do at this point? I would cautiously begin to raise interest rates, to encourage bankers to lend more, to head off the future inflation. I believe that on the path that we're on, we're headed for a crisis. When will the crisis come? No one knows. Will we avoid it? Only if we do things differently than what we're doing now. We have to do something, and that brings me back to the topic of this session. We have to do something to end our proclivity to spend and not tax. And this is a bipartisan statement if there ever was one. George Bush gave us the drug bill. He didn't pay for it. George Bush gave us the war in Iraq. He didn't pay for it. Obama, he gives us, or tries to give us lots of benefits, doesn't pay for them. That's not something that's unique to these two people. Since from 1797, the beginning of our republic, to 1930, the United States ran a budget surplus that is in excess of revenues over spending in 2/3 of all non-war years. And when it fought wars, it paid down the debt. That may have been a good or a bad policy, but that was the policy. Since 1930, when that policy ended, there have only been, as I said earlier, 2 presidents who had back-to-back surpluses in the budget. All the rest of the time, or most of it, we were running deficits. And the deficits are becoming larger and larger and larger, not only in value, but in share of GDP. So that's a game that has to end. The future of the United States has to be heavily to export, because the debt is owed, at least 30 to 40% of it is owed to foreigners. So in order to pay the interest on that debt, we have to export more. That's the only way we can avoid defaulting on the debt. So we're going to have to be an export-oriented society for the future. Now, what happens if we don't do some of these things, like try to come to a budget compromise? Well, 40% of the debt is under 2 years. So if interest rates go up, as they surely will, within 2 years, for every 1% that the interest rate rises, it costs the taxpayers, it costs the Treasury $36 billion. So a 3% rise in interest rates, which is likely, adds over $100 billion to the budget deficit. Congress, as you have to know from just watching the news or reading the newspaper or general osmosis, you have to know that Congress can't agree on anything very much about cutting budget deficits. And they're going to get hit with $100 billion or more each year. Each year. And in addition to that, the Federal Reserve turns over 90% of its earnings. At current interest rates, it turns over something like $90 billion a year. But when interest rates rise and their bonds go down in value, they're going to have much less. So just add that on to the $100 or so billion a year that the budget deficit is going to go up. We are facing serious long-term problems. And in addition to the problems that we're going to add that I just talked about, 40% of the debt approximately is held overseas. So the current account deficit, the amount we owe foreigners, is going to go up. We're going to have to pay more to foreigners to service our debts. That's going to produce problems, maybe crises, for us. So what can we do about this problem? The answer is very simple. We have to cut spending and reduce tax rates and increase tax rates. One or the other will be the solution. Now, I said before, I think we need a tax cut, and that's true. But I believe that any compromise that we have for the budget will involve spending cuts and tax increases. About a year or two ago, 2 years ago, when he was running for president, Newt Gingrich, whom I knew for quite a long time, he used to call me on the phone and ask me about various problems, economic problems that he was thinking about. And so one day he called and he asked about the budget. And I said, well, Newt, anything that you can say, the one thing that you can say with certainty is that any agreement for the budget is going to be to have spending reductions and tax increases, especially spending reductions in health care expenditures. Now, he said, I'm not in favor of any tax increases. I said, well, then you're not going to get an agreement because there are people who don't want to cut spending, so your job would be to try to negotiate an agreement in which you get more spending cuts per dollar of tax increase, because the tax increases are going to hurt more than the spending cuts, especially if they're done in the right way. By the right way, I mean in a more humane way, in a most humane way. He said, well, I'm not in favor of tax increases at all, and that was the last time we ever talked. But the fact is, there are going to be, any agreement is going to have revenues, and it's going to have spending cuts. And the problem is to get more spending cuts and less revenue. And that's a political problem, and I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank the organizers of this conference for inviting me here to be a part of this discussion of fiscal rebalancing in the country. And I'm especially pleased to be on the panel with Alan Meltzer. Alan has served the country and the Fed for years as a very observant and thoughtful critic in some cases of the Federal Reserve. We need that. It's a service to the country.
Thank you.
And Alan also chaired the Shadow Open Market Committee for, 26 years or something like that? Now, back in the 50s, wasn't there a radio program, something like Who Knows What Evil Lurks in the Minds of Policymakers? The Shadow Open Market Committee does. So he did that. He is helping the Federal Reserve with our centennial plans. Are you on the fireworks committee for the centennial? Or,
there, yes.
But the Federal Reserve is going to begin to observe the fact that it's 100 years old, and Alan has been advising there. And he's also, as was mentioned in the introduction, the author of a 3-volume set of the history of the Federal Reserve. I dutifully went out and bought all 3 volumes, and I confess I haven't read them yet.
You'll be interested to know that the Chinese have bought the rights to publish that in Chinese.
Really? I'm waiting for the movie, actually.
And they even paid the royalty.
I'm reminded of a great story about Henry Kissinger when he retired from being Secretary of State. A reporter asked him what he was doing, and he said, well, I'm reading Kant in the original, and it's 3 volumes. The verb is in the 3rd. So if you know anything about German sentence structure, so I confess I haven't begun to read them yet, but I own them, which is half the battle.
Half the battle.
I'm sure most of you in the audience are aware I'm not a fiscal guy, and the Federal Reserve looks after monetary policy, and Congress and the administration are responsible for fiscal legislation and fiscal policy. Normally, I would refrain from weighing in on fiscal policy, especially when there's active deliberation on pending legislation. But since the conference's title includes the option of monetization of the national debt and solving the problem of high national debt, I don't think it will be out of bounds for me to talk a little bit about that concern. Now, as always, I'm speaking for myself, not for the Federal Reserve System or the FOMC. These are my personal views. My colleagues may not agree. I was in a conference just a few days ago when another Fed official got up and went through this ritualistic disclaimer, and he said, my views don't represent policy of the Federal Reserve. But then he said, but I damn well hope they do someday. So you can add that, but please don't quote me, Steve, on that one. I want to begin with a personal flashback over 40 years. I began my career as an international banker with what's now Citigroup 42 years ago. And I worked in the Middle East during that period in the first few years of my career. And in the early years on the job, I recall going to training seminars that were put on by the senior wise men and women of the bank on the management of country exposure. And they taught us that when doing country risk evaluation, you should go to the country's central bank balance sheet as a starting point for your analysis. They taught us to work through some what you might call yes-no questions to understand what's happening in the monetary realm of the country. Is the central bank's balance sheet growing or is it stable? If it's growing, is the growth of money financing a current government deficit by the purchase of government debt? If it is, does it appear that the central bank is doing so under political pressure? And if that is the picture, then the appropriate conclusion, we were taught, was that you do not increase country exposure, or at least you proceed very cautiously, and you avoid being long in the local currency. So what's the logic of that thought process that I was exposed to, as I said, over 40 years ago, when I had no inkling whatsoever I'd ever end up at the Federal Reserve? Well, first, a banker managing country exposure would rightly be concerned about the inflation potential of expansion of the money supply and the associated currency risk. And more fundamentally, the politicization of monetary policy is a serious red flag. My bank was very wary of a situation where the independence of the central bank in the formulation of monetary policy seemed to have been compromised. The situation described, if it lasted for a long period of time, amounts to monetization of public debt. One of the 3 possibilities mentioned in the title of this conference as a way to solve the problem in this country of excessive national debt. Monetization in its classic form involves the central bank intentionally printing money to finance ongoing government deficits, deficits that may give short-term political advantage to the incumbent political establishment. In short, we were taught back then to steer clear of situations where politicians appear to be using the central bank to retain power or reap other political gains. On the face of it, someone might argue that this description applies to the United States and our central bank today. I don't agree with that view, and I'd like to put recent and current Fed policy in context. In response to the deepest recession in the past 75 years, the Federal Open Market Committee, the FOMC, has pursued very accommodative monetary policy. The Fed has engaged in asset purchases, including Treasury securities, that have increased the size of the balance sheet. These purchases have been executed in the open market at market prices. The FOMC has also provided forward guidance on how long we will hold the interbank lending rate at effectively zero. We've done so in an environment where inflation is running at or often below the FOMC's official inflation rate target of 2%. The economy has been expanding for over 4 years now. Through this period of recovery, labor markets have been very slow to improve. Given these circumstances, I've been a consistent supporter of accommodative monetary measures, and I, for the time being, continue to do so. The FOMC has two statutory objectives, I'm sure you know this, under what is called our dual mandate. These are statutory objectives given to us by Congress. They are maximum employment and price stability, or low and stable inflation. Achievement of these two objectives has been the focus of policy decisions. While pursuing these objectives with very accommodative monetary policy, it is a fact that the federal government has been running deficits, and deficit spending by nature adds to the national debt. The coincidence of accommodative monetary policy and growing national debt does not mean that they are purposely interconnected. Legally, the Treasury is prohibited from selling securities directly to the Federal Reserve, and that provides a measure of protection against fiscal policy pressure on monetary policy. My colleagues and I have repeatedly stressed the need for credible long-term fiscal reform to reduce budget deficits, stabilize the debt, and bring it down in relation to the scale of our economy. So fiscal reform is the only real option in the title of this conference. So I object to the view that the Fed is monetizing debt. Let me back that up. The FOMC basically has two policy tools in use at this time. The first is a conditional commitment to keep short-term interest rates low at least as long as the unemployment rate remains above 6.5%, with the proviso that inflation 1 to 2 years ahead is projected to be no more than a 0.5 percentage point above the committee's long-run goal of 2%, and that longer-term inflation expectations continue to be well anchored. A change in the inflation picture would justify a change of policy. The second policy tool is the large-scale asset purchase program, as we call it, or quantitative easing as it is commonly known. These purchases of longer maturity government and government agency securities are designed to put downward pressure on longer-term interest rates, support mortgage markets, and help make broader financial conditions conducive to growth and declining unemployment. The current asset purchase program, which follows two earlier programs, is also a conditional commitment. It will stay in force until the outlook for the labor market has improved substantially, always in the context of price stability. As a result of these three rounds of asset purchases, as Alan pointed out, the Fed's balance sheet has grown from about $800 billion prior to the financial crisis and recession to about $3 trillion today. The balance sheet continues to grow under the current policy at a pace of $85 billion per month. In my view, the logic of the large-scale asset purchases or quantitative easing is pretty straightforward, and I've already touched on some of it. In response to a severe recession that involved over 8 million people losing their jobs, the FOMC cut its policy rate effectively to zero. The target for the federal funds rate hit the so-called zero lower bound in December 2008 and has stayed there ever since. The FOMC has judged that the economy needs more monetary stimulus to sustain the recovery. In the situation where the short-term policy rate cannot go any lower, the available option is to undertake quantitative easing with the effect of exerting downward pressure on longer-term interest rates. Quantitative easing is a form of interest rate policy undertaken in very unusual circumstances. At the risk of getting too technical, let me explain that large-scale asset purchases have involved creating, or if you wish, printing, to use the popular imagery, excess bank reserves on the book of the Fed, as opposed to broad, potentially inflationary money circulating in the economy. I recognize that because of the growth of the balance sheet, there is some risk over the longer term of inflation expectations rising and actual inflation accelerating. But that chemistry is not at work today, and it will take substantial credit growth to materialize. Rapid credit growth is likely to be associated with a much stronger economy accompanied by rising consumer and business confidence. I'm confident those improving conditions will be easily recognizable, and the committee has a variety of tools to counter inflationary pressures with tightening measures. One very important tool is interest on excess reserves, or IOER. Chairman Ben Bernanke emphasized a few days ago in Atlanta that the Fed has the IOER tool ready for an eventual cycle of removing accommodation, a device that was not in the tool bag in earlier periods that strengthens the traditional approach to tightening. The ability to raise the IOER with the expectation that market-based rates will rise in concert alleviates some of the urgency of reducing the size of the balance sheet early in a process of reducing accommodation. Now, I acknowledge we are navigating in uncharted waters in some respects with the growth of the size and the composition of our balance sheet. But I'm convinced we're weighing the benefits of the policy against the possible longer-term costs in a balanced way. A variation on the accusation of monetization, and Alan mentioned this, has been aired from time to time. It is that the Fed is consciously aiding and abetting deficit spending by keeping interest rates low. And it is pointed out the financing of the national debt will become much more expensive as interest rates normalize. It's worth pointing out that the deficit projections of the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, do include the assumption of higher interest rates. In their benchmark scenarios, they assume the 10-year Treasury will average 4.5% over 2015 to 2018 and 5.2% from 2019 to 2023. So they do have a reasonable increase in financing rates built into their analysis of the deficits. And per their analysis, over the next 10 years, deficits do fall relative to recent levels under current law. The accusation of intentional suppression of government financing costs, in my view, is unfounded. Modern monetary policy works primarily through the credit channel. Interest is the cost of credit. If the overriding objective is to support and boost economic growth, to maximize employment, always in the context of low inflation, then the Fed has to try to ease financial conditions. This means trying to lower interest rates and keep them low until the economy measurably improves. A low cost of borrowing by the federal government is a byproduct of a policy focused on nursing the economy back to full health. And with success, the ultra-low interest rate conditions are likely to give way to higher rates whether or not the government is borrowing. I would add that investors around the world seem to be accepting this view. U.S. financial markets are still considered a safe haven for capital. The dollar is in fact strengthening, and investors do not seem to be overly concerned that the FOMC's policies will stoke inflation over the longer term. Perceptions, nonetheless, can shape reality. The broad Main Street public may be worried about our commitment to sustaining low inflation. In this regard, I want to stress again that the FOMC has adopted now a formal inflation target of 2% over the longer term. We've laid down a commitment to keep inflation as measured by the Personal Consumption Expenditure Price Index to a long-term trend, as I said, of 2%. This puts an exclamation point on a track record of inflation averaging around 2% for the past 20 years. In addition, the FOMC has greatly increased the transparency and rationale of its decision-making from even a few years ago. Communication of the rationale of its decision-making. We regard our enhanced communications as a policy tool in itself. I do believe the current makeup of monetary policy is contributing to the gradual improvement in economic performance by creating conditions that support rising incomes. Rising incomes and a stronger economy with more people employed should increase tax revenues, other things equal. And this is the appropriate way for the Federal Reserve to support improvement in our nation's fiscal situation. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alan and Dennis. I should have mentioned at the outset that Dennis is not speaking in his official capacity with the Federal Reserve, but in his personal capacity alone. Okay, in our next step, we'll simply ask Dennis and Alan to question or comment upon each other's presentations, and then I'll have a question or two, and we'll open it up for a public discussion.
Since I'm warmed up, should I go ahead first?
Sure.
Okay. Well, I was thinking when Alan was calling our policy cockeyed that maybe it would have been better if I'd gone first in my presentation rather than after him, but he talked at the beginning about what he called a flawed recovery, a slow recovery, and I mean, the facts speak for themselves. It's been a very, very slow recovery, and I think many of the reasons for that he cited in his comments, and I have really or very little in the way of a difference of opinion on that. We have been through a period of deleveraging, of household deleveraging, and early on corporate deleveraging. We've had a long period of unemployment, which has kept some people out of, it has worried people about their consumption and therefore has added to relatively weak consumer growth. Very importantly, Alan focused on uncertainty, and we've had both bouts of uncertainty related to global developments, for example, the sovereign debt crisis in Europe, as well as continuing uncertainty in this country related to regulation on the part of businesses and job security and just the future of the economy on the part of both businesses and consumers or individuals. Alan mentioned regulation. Regulation clearly weighs on the minds of business people. I talked to a lot of business people across the southeast of the United States, and this has been a recurring theme over the last 3 to 4 years. Uncertainty about how regulations that affect their particular businesses are going to affect them. And that has caused a real cautiousness about hiring, a reluctance to hire. There have been periods in which certainly the feedback I was getting is that hiring a person is you just wait until you have practically no choice to hire someone, just because of the difficulty in calculating the return on incremental employee 3, 4, or 5 years out because of health care costs or other potential costs. I think there has been some shift in the decision making, and again, this is anecdotal, it's hard to prove this, in the trade-off between hiring an individual and making an investment in productive technology, software or whatever. One of our directors said that 10 years ago you would hire a person and then support that person with technology. Now it seems to be somewhat the other way around. You hire or you buy the technology and then if necessary support the technology with an individual. That may or may not be a true paradigm shift, but we get that in talking to people. So it has been a very slow recovery for a number of reasons. Alan also spoke about the limits of monetary policy and has said that monetary policy can't solve real economy problems. Well, here I may have a slightly different view. Monetary policy cannot be targeted on micro problems or sectoral problems. Monetary policy is broad and affects essentially the whole economy. It's macroeconomic policy, but it can have some influence on aggregate demand in the economy, and aggregate demand essentially is what, when translated down to the business level or the employer level, gives a rationale for hiring someone, making an investment. So in that sense, monetary policy does have some effect. But he commented on the limits of monetary policy, and in many respects I agree. As I said in my remarks, monetary policy operates through credit. For better or for worse, it operates through the cost of money. When people are reluctant to borrow, and the bankers would generally say their reason for not lending so much and for carrying large reserves is a lack of what they would call qualified loan demand, or a weakness in qualified loan demand. Monetary policy can't make banks lend. It can simply set the incentive structure, which is based on the interest rate. And then the final part of Alan's remarks basically said we're doing all the wrong things, and here are some of the right things. He included monetary policy among the wrong things. Maybe we have a difference of point of view on that. But he also commented on fiscal discipline, balanced budgets, coming to a budget compromise, ultimately that may involve both cuts and tax increases. And essentially I agree. I have viewed and have said publicly that I think, first, our fiscal rebalancing and fiscal challenges, and I would include in that long-term entitlement challenges, and I would say pensions at the state and local level, public sector pensions at the state and local level. This is the issue of our times. I am a strong believer that nothing goes well if you don't get the finances right. And the finances of the country are not right today. So it's something that has to be tackled. It doesn't have to be solved overnight, but it has to be tackled in a credible way so that the world, quite literally, the holders of our foreign debt, believe that we're on a track to a reasonable balance in our fiscal affairs. So in that respect, I think we're very much on the same wavelength.
Yeah, let me continue this harmony for a few moments before we get to the raw meat. I think the Fed has done some remarkable things. Enhanced communication is one of them. You know, there was a time when I used to tear what little hair I have left because they wouldn't announce what federal funds rate they were setting. They kept it secret. How could it be a secret? They would go to the market and set the rate. Everybody in the market knew about that. It was the rest of us that weren't supposed to know. You know, it took until 1994. That is way, 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 way deep into the history of the Federal Reserve. So they're doing much better. They understand, there's been a real understanding, improvement in understanding, that the market depends upon what they say, and they depend upon what the market does. So they have a community of interest. In the days when you thought you could try to fool them are long past. We certainly agree that you can't solve this problem by monetizing the debt. You know, unfortunately, last year the Fed bought 75% or more of all the Treasury issues. So they, in my view, are monetizing the debt. Now, why they're doing that, not perhaps because they want to monetize the debt, but because they want to keep interest rates at these mistakenly low rates. And we certainly agree that it's the credit markets that are the way in which policy gets implemented. For a long time, at least until under the Bernanke was very influenced by an economist who's a brilliant man and wrong. And he has models in which there is no credit and there are no debt. It just doesn't matter. Credit doesn't matter. The debt doesn't matter. We had a credit crisis. How was the Fed operating that way to know that we're having a credit crisis? That's just another example of a mistake. Now, Dennis, as many people do, including market people, I mean the Fed is not alone in that, say, well, the inflation rate is very low. Well, the inflation rate that they use to measure inflation is very low. But that inflation rate doesn't include energy prices, doesn't include food prices. The reason is because they say, well, those are very subject to very big random changes, and most of those changes are temporary. Do you think that the food prices are temporarily high or permanently high? Do you think that energy prices at the gas pump are going to come back to the levels of 10 years ago, or are going to stay up somewhere around $3 to $4 a gallon? I don't think there are many people who think that those are temporary increases in energy prices. Perhaps I'll be wrong. It's happened. But you don't get a correct measure of inflation if you leave out the prices that are permanently increasing, like energy and food prices. Those rates are somewhat higher, and those are the rates that people pay. Now, what concerns me most is not just that the Fed is inflating, and that we will have an inflation, I believe, but that all the countries, the major countries in the world, are doing it at the same time. Japan, the last one to join, is in the newspapers all the time about their big expansion. They've announced that they're going to double the size of their balance sheet in 2 years. Britain, inflating. The ECB, the European Central Bank, inflating. Those are all the major countries in the world. Have we had that before? Yes. How does it end? It ends in inflation. You know, do they have the tools? Dennis mentioned, well, what Chairman Bernanke says all the time. We'll raise the interest rate. We'll pay the banks to hold these excess reserves, and therefore they won't be able to lend them. Well, I have two comments on that. How high do those interest rates have to go? The only time that Chairman Bernanke has mentioned how high they would go, he used a number like 4 or 5%. If he gets away with 4 or 5%, he's remarkable. You know, the problem with an answer that says we're going to raise interest rates is interest rates are a political element as well as an economic element. When you raise the interest rate, you find businessmen, labor unions, congressmen, administrations, the general public saying, you're killing the economy, and there's a lot of pressure. And unfortunately, the Fed accedes to that pressure in the past and is likely to do so again in the future. That bothers me. What also bothers me is this low interest rate policy is making people living on pensions, well-intentioned, decent people living on pensions. A lot of them kept their money in bank deposits, bank certificates of deposit, which paid them 3, 4, 5% interest, and they lived on the earnings of their money and interest. Now those interest rates are down around 1% or less, and they can't afford to live on them. So what they do is they're investing, they're taking their money and putting it into risky, much riskier loans, emerging market debt, risky American bonds, and we know how that ends. It ends in tears, and that's a crisis for them, which is coming along, and it's not clear how we're going to avoid it. The other side of that is pension funds, the funds that have promised to pay them pensions when they retire. They estimate that they're going to earn, most of them, 7 to 8% on their investments. Not today. They're lucky if they get 3%. So they have big gaps, and they too are encouraged to take super risks to try to improve their earnings so they can meet those requirements. That's true at the state and local level, and it's true with the corporate at the level of the corporations. Policies like that run big risks, and the risk is you end in tears. Farmland, well, you certainly know about that here in Iowa. Prices of farmland are going up. All kinds of rational reasons are given for that, ethanol and so on. We've been there many, many times. We know what happens. I just hope that we're not going to repeat what has happened before with farmers borrowing heavily in order to buy farmland because it's going up in price. We know how that ends. It ends in tears. Those are risks, big risks that we're taking. They're not the only risks, but they're at least high on the list of what I want to tell you about. Finally, let me say, the Fed has increased, as Dennis said, its balance sheet by a factor of 4. This is supposed to be a government of laws and not of men. What restriction is there on the Federal Reserve from increasing its balance sheet by trillions of dollars over a short period of time? Unfortunately, there's none. Now, the Constitution of the United States gives Congress the right to coin money and regulate the value thereof. So the Fed is their agent, and the system we have is, in this sense, also broken, because Congress does not do its job. It can't find a way to discipline the Fed and make them at least ask permission to quadruple the size of their balance sheet. No, in my opinion, no entity in government or private life should have that much unrestrained power. That's a threat to our system. Do I think that Chairman Bernanke and his colleagues are going to do something terrible beyond what they've already done? No, I believe they're patriots and that they're doing things that they think are right, but I think are wrong, and I don't think anybody, whether they are right or I am right, anyone should have the unrestrained power to do what they have been doing. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. Ms. Schwartz,
Can I just make one comment that I think is important for everybody? As a central banker, it's a cardinal virtue, obviously, to keep my eye on inflation at all times. And there's no way that Professor Meltzer knows how I go about monitoring inflation. So I thought I'd just mention that. We use in my reserve bank a dashboard of over 15 different measures of prices. So you have a headline or overall inflation with a couple of indices, core inflation with a couple of indices, trimmed mean. We look at producer prices. We get inputs from surveys, and so we have on our website that dashboard if you're interested. But I think there's a very important point that is sometimes in the public debate gets lost. Relative price changes are going to happen all the time. Energy prices will go up, energy prices will go down. They'll go down or up relative to food. Prices change all the time. Monetary policy cannot affect or control relative price changes. We can only have reasonable control over the overall direction of all prices. So when you hear the term food inflation or healthcare cost inflation or energy inflation, in a very technical sense, it's a misnomer. Inflation is all prices rising. It's the inverse of the loss of purchasing power of the domestic currency. And that's what monetary policy can influence, but we can't influence relative prices.
I certainly agree with all of that, completely agree with all of that. Where we differ, just so people understand where we differ, is that the index that you most frequently emphasize is the one which excludes two of those prices. And you gave the reason why, generally given, for why you exclude them, because they're noisy and they go up and down. So
I think if you check, Alan, you'll see that the official statement is the PCE, the overall, the headline PCE index that includes energy and food. But the point is we monitor these things in a bunch of different ways in order to really get an overall sense of what's happening to prices in the economy.
I just want to comment that I think there's a significant area of agreement between Alan and Dennis, and correct me if I'm wrong. Alan, you had commented at the outset that one of the big problems we have today is that banks are not investing, they're not lending from their excess reserves. And Dennis, at the end of your talk, I believe I heard that you said that the Fed was about to or considering imposing interest on excess reserves, which I assume would be equivalent of a tax on a bank that does not use an excess reserve.
It's the interest paid on excess reserves, which the Board of Governors is capable of moving by administrative action, and which will be a bellwether for market rates, including the Fed funds rate, as well as longer-term, longer maturity market rates. And the ability to decide to move that up, it gives us greater control over monetary policy than arguably we had when there was no such tool. That's the point.
Okay.
It's not going to be, at least not yet, that the banks will pay us for those reserves.
Okay, now the reason I asked the question is that about 2 months ago I was in a meeting with Alan Blinder, another great economist, and he argues that banks in fact should be taxed for not using their excess reserves. And I wonder what you think of that.
It's an idea that's been out there. I simply emphasize that our ability to pay interest on excess reserves gives us an ability to tighten interest rates. The opposite would not be a monetary tool. Really, it would be maybe a credit-oriented credit allocation kind of tool, but not a monetary tool in the same way that the ability to pay on interest on excess reserves is.
There's nothing that bankers would like to do more than to make profitable loans. So an idea that says you're going to tax them for not using their excess reserves doesn't get around the question about why they don't use their excess reserves. The reason they don't use their excess reserves is because there is not good demand for borrowing at prices and risk factors that encourage them to make those loans. So you don't solve that problem by penalizing them. You solve that problem by creating conditions under which they want to lend. What would those conditions be? An interest rate which is high enough to cover the risk that they perceive in making those loans. That's not the risk, that's not the interest rate that we have, and that's why they have so much excess reserve. When I say so many, $2 trillion or more.
And, from that regard, and I agree with you, what do you think about the Dodd-Frank Act, which essentially requires the definition of qualified mortgage? And so if a lender would make a loan to a borrower thinking that it's a qualified mortgage loan, if it turns out in retrospective it isn't, there may be questions as to whether the loan is even enforceable, and there potentially could be penalties imposed on the lenders. Doesn't that really have a counterproductive impact?
Yes. Look, if there's risk, the risk exists in the world because of the way in which the world is regulated and the way in which people behave. That's a fact. We can't play games to try to change that. We can lower risk by doing things which lower risk, but we can't arbitrarily decide that we're going to make mortgages which are risk-free. Risk-free mortgages don't exist, and we can't make them exist. What we can do is try to get the markets to do what we want them to do by changing the interest rate so that they want to make those loans.
On the mortgage question, the Federal Reserve and other regulators are implementing the Dodd-Frank Act, which was passed by Congress. So we're implementing the law. That involves some rulemaking. I hear from mortgage bankers frequently that whether it's qualified mortgage regulations or other requirements, the process of approving a loan and of making a loan and documenting it has slowed down fairly dramatically from 2006 and 2007, that they simply have to be more careful. I'm sure someone in the room, and I can tell you from my personal experience of refinancing my house, has been through the requests for documentation of salaries or investments or whatever that at some stages seem to be irrational. But the mortgage bankers are being extraordinarily careful, and so that is, in a way, an unintended consequence of this effort to try to tighten up the mortgage business, which I think most people would say, based on the experience of 2006 and before, was necessary. So it's complicated, and I'm not defending it. We're implementing the law.
Charles?
Yeah, so I agree with that last comment on the mortgages. So I'm not a mortgage lender, but I run our mortgage research team, and it's definitely our judgment that the Fed has been a big enabler of more credit to the mortgage sector than we would otherwise have gotten. But I'm also, I'm predominantly sympathetic to the view that the regulatory uncertainty that still confronts the mortgage market, and it's colossal. It's hard to overestimate just how much the mortgage financial sector is starting from scratch, and thinking about how capital flows from to savers to households that want to borrow to buy a house. And I do think until that uncertainty resolves, until the new rules of the road, so-called, which are partly in place, but until those are more completely in place, it's very difficult, I think, to clear that market at levels that you would normally expect, and mortgage supply to be supplying at this stage of the cycle. I did have a question. I had a question for Professor Meltzer, and you know, I was a child of the 70s, and I decided to be economist in the early 80s. And I should just say at the outset that Professor Meltzer is one of the heroes of my early education, in the sense that he was, you know, the good guy on the side of the good guys when the Fed was I would say in hindsight quite clearly on the side of the bad guys. But these days, you know, I'm a disciple of Bernanke. That was literally true when I was an academic, and and now I'm a beneficiary, I suppose, as a investment banker in the private sector. But I'm curious about, to me, so the theme that I can't reconcile between the Fed view and the shadow open market view is on price stability. And I guess, you know, from the street's perspective, and I think from the perspective of most investors, the Fed, there are a lot of investors, it should be pointed out, especially in the credit market where I spend most of my time, who have, you know, sort of a deep-seated gut sense that it's wrong to bail out, you know, private sector. It's wrong to bail out the economy. It's wrong to bail out financial firms, and that you're supposed to let chips fall, and that preserves incentives. And after the break, I'm going to talk entirely about incentives, which I think is like the big theme that's being underappreciated in the world today, both well, mainly in the policy setting world, in the regulatory world. But having said that, when I think about the value added to the Fed, and I think about what we complained about in the 70s and the 80s when the Fed wasn't maintaining a stable price target, I think about it as providing certainty, because it provides a predictable value of the unit of exchange. And the way I understand QE is not as a deliberate attempt to provide cheap funding for the banking system, but rather that's a means to an end, in the end of which is to push as hard as you can on the tools that you have at hand to try to maintain price stability, which is your legal mandate. And I think from an investing perspective, part of the reason why investment doesn't show up is that if you think we're stuck in a deflationary spiral, and nobody thinks that at the moment, but it wasn't so long ago that when I would go out to visit you know, fund managers, and we would talk about what are the big risks in the outlook at the moment, that deflationary spiral was at the top of the list. And of course, when you think you're about to be stuck in a deflationary spiral, and if you don't know what that looks like, you can look at Japan. It lost 2 decades of growth during over a period during which they seemed to be stuck at, you know, at the so-called zero lower bound, and where nothing looked worth investing in. Prices moved, you know, down on average. And where I think, you know, now the Bank of Japan, if you're reading the newspaper, is very much in the news, you know, trying to break out of that 20-year cycle with a more aggressive, you know, QE type of an approach, maybe QE times 2. We'll see. But I guess my question is, if we're and we can talk about whether balance sheet, you know, whether growth is the way the Fed should be doing it, or whether maybe there's a better way to do it through forward guidance. But as long as inflation is not a clear and present danger, and we have to be, of course, forecasting what inflation is going to be, you know, we have to steer the tanker, the super tanker, in such a way that it gets to where we want it to be a year from now, let's say. As long as inflation doesn't look like it's a risk, either because the measured inflation is moving, or because surveyed inflation expectations are moving, or because financial market indicators of inflation expectations are moving, or because traditional GDP, you know, gap type of drivers of inflation are moving. If everything is dead, then why is it, and I understand that things can change in a hurry, but why shouldn't the Fed be doing everything that it can under its mandate to try to push, to bring things back to life, I guess. And then I guess, well, I'll stop there.
Thanks, Charles. We only have 5 minutes left, so let me make sure we do have some time, at least, for questions from the audience.
Okay, let me just answer that very quickly. The reason the Fed should stop is what I said at the beginning. We have mainly real problems. The Fed cannot do anything about real problems. It can build up very serious problems by having trillions of dollars that it's going to have to drain from the system. You know, they say, well, we'll just raise interest rates. And I say, how high? And I'm not satisfied with an answer which says 4 to 5%. We're talking about draining gradually, maybe not so gradually, trillions of dollars. We've never been there before. No one else has ever been there before. When you see a problem where you've never been before and no one else has been before, there ought to be a caution flag about what you're doing now. It isn't doing much good. Everyone agrees that it's very laggard. I believe it's because it's a real problem that they cannot address for the most part, and therefore they should stop doing what they're doing and try to prevent a future crisis.
Thanks, Alan. Let's take 2 or 3 questions. Let the panelists decide how they want to respond to them. And let me insist that you confine your remarks to questions, not comments, and brief questions. Thank you. In the back there? Yes, you.
I've heard many read and bankers and economists talk on our unemployment rate, which is around 7%. There's a lot of belief out there that I've even heard the word never used, and that's a word we should never use, that interest rates will not rise or tend to rise until we get unemployment rates 6.25 or below. Would you gentlemen comment on that?
Let's take one more question. There was one over here. Yes.
Yeah, my question was, well, primarily for Dennis, but anyway, Japan is mentioned as in a deflationary cycle, and they're currently becoming very expansionary in their monetary policy. I guess I've always wondered, is the ECB not being expansionary enough? What I see going on, I think Japan is doing the right thing, and shouldn't the ECB be doing more of that in Europe?
Alan, Dennis, go
I'll
ahead.
take the second question just because there's a technical answer that doesn't require that I opine on another central bank's policy, and that is that they are a single mandate central bank, and their mandate is prices and inflation only, and we have to balance 2 objectives. That does, on the margin, change a little bit, although I certainly think Mario Draghi has become quite aggressive, and in my mind, appropriately so, to try to make sure that the debt crisis doesn't get out of control. On the earlier question, which had to do with the unemployment rate, I'll just simply repeat what the FOMC has communicated, and that is that we've made the federal funds rate, the official interest rate policy, contingent upon or conditioned upon getting to a threshold of 6.5%. A threshold, not a trigger. So there's nothing automatic about it. Conditions would have to be taken into consideration at that time, but the guidance has been that in all likelihood the policy rate will remain where it is until we get to that point. We said nothing about getting lower than that. One of my colleagues has proposed that conceivably we put out even a lower number, but the policy of the committee is 6.5%.
Thanks. We will reconvene in 15 minutes here. So for now, please join me in thanking our 2 panelists. I should mention that Dennis Lockhart will have to leave a little early to catch a plane. Okay, with no further ado, let's start with Steve.
Thank you, Mark. I'm going to try to think through a U.S. debt default, and I'll start with, is the United States likely to default on its national debt? And I think most would agree with the view that an eventual default would be unlikely, but it is conceivable. And the harm that such a default could cause could be so devastating that I think it's important to try to think through how it might occur, how it might be avoided, and how its consequences could be mitigated. Now, the classic view is that a national debt default ultimately depends on a country's expenditures exceeding taxes and new borrowings. But that view, which doesn't really finally differentiate between liquidity and insolvency, may give insufficient emphasis to what I call rollover risk. And to give an example of rollover risk, Peter Fisher, the senior managing director of BlackRock and former Undersecretary of the Treasury, has observed in a recent conference in which he and I participated at the Wharton School at Penn that if you ask Treasury or Finance Ministry officials responsible for debt management what keeps you up at night, the only candid reply would be the risk of not being able to roll over their debt at the next auction. And in practice, debt sustainability is about the so-called rollover risk. Now, this mirrors one of my earliest experiences when I practiced law. The County of Monroe in New York had short-term revenue anticipation notes coming due. And for years, it simply came up, you had an official stood up on the courthouse steps and offered new notes for sale at public auction. But at that time, New York City was going through a financial crisis. No one showed up to buy these revenue anticipation notes, and the county almost defaulted. We put together the first underwritten municipal financed offering. But this illustrates the problem of the rollover risk, that short-term debt that funds long-term projects cannot be rolled over or refinanced. And this risk is inherent in any use of short-term debt to fund a long-term project. Now, this risk, rollover risk, is probably the fundamental concern underlying the so-called shadow banking system. And consider, for example, asset-backed commercial paper conduits, special purpose entities that fund themselves with short-term financing. They almost routinely will invest in long-term assets, such as long-term financial assets. And this introduces rollover risk. Now, there is a cogent reason to do this, and that's that short-term debt, all things being equal, tends to be much cheaper than long-term debt. And so if you could issue, for example, 30-day commercial paper and roll it over every month, then you could provide financing at a much lower cost than if you financed the long-term asset with long-term debt. And therefore, any rollover risk must be balanced against the cost savings. Now, in U.S. national financing, we likewise are seeing significant short-term debt funding of long-term projects. Economists have estimated that the U.S. rolls over half of its debt every 2 years. And therefore, there's a real threat to the U.S. that at some point we might, for whatever reason, not be able to do the rollover. And this goes to an issue of liquidity, not insolvency. The U.S. may well be solvent, but we may not have the cash at the time. Now, economists have also linked private sector shadow banking rollover risk and government debt rollover risk. And so Zoltan Pozsar of the IMF has argued, as part of the conference I was at, that the financial crisis revealed a problem of excessive private money creation in response to an insufficient supply of Treasury bills. And he proposes a simple solution. He says we should increase the supply of Treasury bills in order to attract funding away from risky shadow banking investments into U.S. debt securities. But he realizes that issuing more T-bills would create more rollover risk for the federal government. He believes that that still, on balance, makes sense because it would be less disruptive than basically putting a lot of financing into shadow bank investments. But because of the increase in rollover risk, the U.S. must pay increasing attention to managing that risk. Now, we have the dual mandate of the Fed, and really managing debt risk is not technically within that dual mandate. But I would argue that it certainly should be part of the mandate that central banks, the Fed and other central banks today, really should look not only to increasing employment, getting the economy moving and managing inflation, but making sure that there is financial prudence in terms of debt issuance. Now, one of the concerns this conference addresses is the federal debt ceiling. And I would sort of put that aside as a major concern, that the debt ceiling could exacerbate rollover risk by possibly, and I would have a counter argument, which I can go technical, but possibly limiting the amount of new debt that can be issued to pay maturing debt. But I don't see that as a problem because this debt ceiling is purely artificial and Congress could change it any time. So how do we set about to try to avoid default? And the United States has a lot of flexibility to avoid default, even if there is increased rollover risk. Now, it can monetize the debt or essentially print money. Because the U.S. dollar is a major reserve currency, the U.S. can pretty easily sell dollars. We query whether this might change in the future if the U.S. dollar loses its role as the international reserve currency. And also, I'll talk in a few minutes about other effects of monetization, such as increased inflation. The U.S. could also potentially sell assets. And Professor Richard Herring of the Wharton School at Penn argues that sovereigns can almost always sell sufficient assets to service their debts. But this assumes those sales can be made on a timely enough basis to pay maturing debt. And asset sales also may well be politically unpopular, like mortgaging the future. Notwithstanding this flexibility, there could be problems that we can't solve. For example, one commentator has argued that, quote, "What I see truly driving us off the real cliff is the bond bubble bursting, spiking interest rates, and causing a massive crash in the derivatives market. I don't see Uncle Sam printing up $70 trillion to cover the derivatives exposure of just J.P. Morgan." Now, the Dodd-Frank Act attempts to mitigate this risk. For example, it limits the Federal Reserve's ability to act as a lender of last resort. It requires systemically important financial institutions to draw up so-called living wills that specify how they could liquidate, if needed, with minimal systemic impact. However, in my experience, and I worked as a bankruptcy lawyer before I became a full-time academic, it's rare that a firm during good times is able to predict with any degree of accuracy what might happen during bad times. And I would bet that the Fed ultimately will need to face the requirement to act as a lender of last resort, at least in some cases. But this creates a bit of a dilemma. Because the Fed will, in fact, need to act, what do we do about the Dodd-Frank Act's limitations, legal limitations on the Fed's ability to act in that capacity? And I think that of all the stupid things in the Dodd-Frank Act, of which there are many, there are some good things too, this is probably the stupidest. It really ties the hands of the Fed to act judiciously when it needs to do so. The Fed has power, but the power is extremely limited. So you have the risk that a systemically important financial institution could end up defaulting with systemic consequences. Okay, I think we're getting feedback. Those are systemic consequences. This is a soundtrack here.
That's negative feedback.
That's right, exactly.
I got different negative feedback as well. So.
Oh, wait, till. Great. So, anyway, a systemically important financial institution could end up defaulting precisely because the Fed is limited in acting. And the cost of trying to address the resulting systemic consequences could itself bankrupt the country. Now, the Dodd-Frank Act also ignores the systemic implications of financial markets. Yet, in our era of increasing disintermediation, effectively the removal of the need, in many cases, for banks to act as the intermediary of funds between capital and financial markets on the one hand, and firms that use money on the other hand, because of that, financial markets increasingly will be triggers and transmitters of systemic risk. Take an example of the last financial crisis. At least it was partly market-driven. Subprime mortgage loans had been bundled together as collateral to partially support the payment of mortgage-backed securities. When home prices began falling, some of the mortgage-backed securities began defaulting, or at least were downgraded. And this destroyed investor confidence in debt ratings and caused debt markets more broadly to collapse. If in the future financial markets collapse with systemic consequences, the cost of trying to address those consequences again could bankrupt the country. Now, beyond all of this, there are other problems, I think, that are not being recognized at all. And here I'll refer to special purpose entities and hidden debt. None of the analyses I've seen of the U.S.'s debt problems take into account the fact that the public governments, both the federal government and especially the states, increasingly are being operated and financed through special purpose government entities, SPEs, special purpose entities, just like how corporations used SPEs to raise financing off balance sheet. Think Enron. Now, government SPE debt is rarely disclosed as debt of the larger government unit. And that's because the larger government unit, in our case, for example, the U.S., is not technically legally obligated as a guarantor. But nonetheless, it's been shown that a default by one of these SPEs can, because it can destroy the financial reputation and the debt rating of the larger government entity, the larger entity virtually always will stand behind the debt of its SPEs and will support that debt, even though it's not legally obligated to do so. And as an example, I can give plenty of examples in the state context. In the national context, just think how the U.S. government stood behind Fannie and Freddie. Now, compounding this problem, if the U.S. had to step in to support the debt of its own states, the amounts at issue could be huge. And state finances are generally improving, but that improvement ignores the massive amounts of state SPE debt. And in many states, the SPE debt dwarfs the state's general obligation debt. So if states have to come in to support their SPE debt, they may not be able to. The federal government then may have to come in and support the state debt to basically prevent the states from defaulting. So let's step back and now ask, would a default by the U.S. government on its debt be legal? And this is very incongruous. We said a federal government debt default is possible, but it might not be legal. And that's because the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution provides, quote, the validity of the public debt of the United States shall not be questioned, unquote. And this provision was included to prevent a Southern Democratic majority from repudiating Civil War debts. Now, repudiation of debt or questioning the debt's validity may well be different, one would argue, than a payment default. Professor Michael McConnell of Stanford has argued, quote, default is not the same as repudiation. If Congress repudiated the debt, it would be declaring that the debt is not owed. But if Congress defaults on the debt still would be owed. It simply would go unpaid, unquote. Now, you have that position by an academic challenged by one of the country's leading bankruptcy lawyers, Don Bernstein of the Davis Polk law firm, and he argues that the distinction between validity and default is not meaningful in the context of U.S. sovereign debt. And I quote, he says, obligations of the sovereign can be enforced only at the sovereign's own sufferance. So the validity of the debt and the debt's enforceability merge to become a single concept. So there are certainly issues as to whether a default would be a 14th Amendment violation. Now let's turn to what would be the consequences of a U.S. debt default. And you certainly would have immediate economic consequences. In 2011, Treasury Secretary Geithner said that a U.S. debt default would raise all borrowing costs. And the reason is that U.S. Treasuries set the benchmark borrowing rate. And therefore, even the threat of a debt default, U.S. debt default, could raise borrowing costs. But those costs and the consequences can also be systemic, and let's consider that. First, let's talk about a so-called soft default. Now, a lot of these terms are not well defined, but I'll use soft default for the moment as essentially meaning that the government increases inflation to effectively reduce the amount that it has to pay. And from the standpoint of creditors, this is often known as an inflation tax. Now, one way to create inflation is to print more money. And as has been discussed, printing money can itself enable the U.S. to repay debt. Inflation, though, can cause a range of negative consequences, as we know, and, motivating investors to demand higher interest rates, thereby ballooning the cost of servicing the federal debt. The former president of the Kansas City Federal Reserve has even argued that the inflation resulting from printing money to pay U.S. debt could, quote, threaten American living standards as well as destroy the independence and credibility of the Federal Reserve. Now, that's a soft default. Now let's turn to what's called a hard default, which is an actual payment default. And observers here have argued that a hard default will likely result in stocks, bonds, and the dollar plummeting in the immediate aftermath. Credit markets will likely freeze, making it hard for companies to borrow to expand. You'd have a downgrading of credit rating on U.S. debt, making it much more difficult and expensive for the country to borrow. Now let's turn back and revisit the idea of the difference between liquidity, a rollover type default, where the nation is not truly insolvent. And this, some observers have referred to as a mere technical hard default. The terms are a little bit weird. So a technical hard default. J.P. Morgan did a report 2 years ago, and they examined the systemic impact of the U.S. missing, although temporarily, an interest or principal payment on its debt, assuming the U.S. was not insolvent, that this was some sort of rollover type risk. And they concluded that that would almost certainly have large, quote, large systemic effects, long-term adverse consequences for Treasury finances and the U.S. economy. And as a minimum, at a minimum, the U.S. would likely see a 1% reduction in GDP due to higher interest rates and a likely equity sell-off. So let's step back and now ask, okay, could we restructure U.S. debt to mitigate these problems. And you could do it in two ways. You could try to restructure U.S. debt before there's an actual default, and you could try to restructure U.S. debt after there is a default. Now, any method of restructuring U.S. debt would have to be very speedy. If to avoid default, of course, the restructuring would have to be in place before the debt came due. And if to mitigate the consequences of a default, time would be of the essence in order to minimize financial chaos. Now, in a non-U.S. sovereign context, I've examined at length how country debt could and should be bilaterally restructured, sort of like a workout. That is, the country and its creditors get together and agree in some way. And, there are ways you can do this and a lot of complications. But bilateral approaches will not necessarily be speedy, nor are they designed to address the uniquely chaotic problem of a U.S. sovereign debt default. Now, the U.S. could attempt unilaterally to restructure its debt. Argentina did that in 2001. Russia did that in 1998. But that would effectively be refusing to pay national debt while dictating to creditors new payment terms. That's close enough, I think, to a debt repudiation to be certain to generate numerous 14th Amendment lawsuits. And indeed, any sovereign unilateral debt restructuring tends to generate multiple lawsuits, even absent constitutional issues. And unilateral debt restructurings would be very costly. Argentine sovereign bond spreads rose 6,000 basis points after its 2001 announcement that it would unilaterally restructure its debt. Oops. And so, finally, you have the potential systemic consequences of a unilateral debt restructuring. It's close enough to a hard default that there may well be a lot of contagion. So what do we learn? What are my concluding observations? I think they're twofold. Number one, as rollover risk increases, the U.S. government should pay increasing attention to managing that risk and should try to balance that risk with the traditionally important goals such as minimizing the cost of debt issuance. And secondly, and this is something that was suggested at the end of the Wharton Conference by the Davis-Polk bankruptcy practitioner, said the lesson for the U.S. is at once blindingly obvious and one that none of us wants to hear. Either the revenue, taxes, must continue to grow, or the cost of government services and benefits and other national financial commitments must be reduced. Finding clever ways to address the nation's existing public debt simply will not solve the problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Our next speaker is Charles Himmelberg.
Okay, thank you. And let me just first say thank you to the organizers for inviting me to this today. It's a thrill to be back in the Midwest, where I grew up and was educated. And I want to say before I go further that it's never fun to be, the Wall Street banker in an event like this these days. But and I also want to say that these views are not the views of Goldman Sachs, although they are greatly influenced and informed by a great team that I have the pleasure to work with. So I thought I would do two things with my comments. First, I wanted to take a crack at the question, which is how will the United States solve the problem of its national debt. It is very much, my job, just to kind of put some context, my job as a strategist at Goldman Sachs is to wear, the economist hat and also the market economist hat, and to translate what we see happening in the economy into what we think that means for different asset classes. And my asset classes are corporate credit and mortgages, but obviously the clients that I spend time advising are very much interested in the broader, bigger picture, especially as it is being driven by the fixed income markets these days, but also equity. It all sort of fits together and reflects one underlying economic reality. So we spend a lot of time debating what's going to happen to the national debt. What does that mean? So I have a lot of clients who worry that it's sowing the seeds for some kind of cataclysm, whether it's a growth disaster or an inflation disaster, or in the worst of all worlds, both. But the fact is that most clients are not investing that way. Most clients have a view of the world which is, I think, relatively benign. Nobody denies that the U.S. debt is an enormous problem, with the exception of one editorial writer for the New York Times, who I was going to mention that that almost everybody takes seriously the debt, and I'm going to come to the comments of that. I think there is a view that when you're in a crisis, and I'm very sympathetic to this, and our House Views was very sympathetic to this, that when you're in the middle of a crisis, you do want to sort of open up all the barrels. You want to deploy, the magnificent, I think, executed monetary policy that the Fed executed in 08 and 09, and you also want to deploy fiscal stimulus to try to blunt, I think, the recessionary spiral effects of a collapse of confidence in the growth outlook. Having said that, you do always, in my opinion, have to be mindful of the long-run consequences and how you're going to get out of the hole, that you're digging for the future, as opposed to the hole that you're digging yourself out today. And I don't know why. It always reminds me, and I'm dating myself a little bit, although this really predates me. But there's a few aging hippies in the audience. There was a Tom Lehrer song about Werner von Braun, who some of you will know was a rocket scientist who worked for Nazi Germany, and then at the end of the war, the U.S. spirited him out and had him design rockets for our side. And the lyrics of the song went, "Once the rockets are up, who cares where they come down? That's not my department," says Werner von Braun. And I'm reminded of that quote every time I hear advocates for more deficit spending arguing that the current recession is the number one priority, and that we can deal with debt levels in the future. But I manifestly think that's not true. If it was true in 2009, it's certainly not true today in 2013. The depth of the recession is now 4 years behind us, and we are definitely in the cleanup stage, where I think we have to clean up the mess that we created for ourselves during that period. When I talk to clients and we think, and you ask the clients, and the Goldman economics and strategy team doesn't really have a concrete view on how the debt to GDP ratio is going to come down, but implicitly I think we do, and that is that we actually have quite a bit of implicit confidence that the American political system will eventually, after it's tried all the alternatives, do the right thing. So if you ask me what do I think is required and what do I think will happen, I think there'll be some increases in taxes. There'll be some increases in spending cuts, and hopefully there'll be growth. And I think a combination of those three ingredients, tax, cut, and grow, will eventually be what stabilizes and then longer term brings the debt to GDP ratio down. There are some alternatives which I want to come back to, namely inflation, and one that hasn't been mentioned much here today, which is financial repression. And those two go hand in glove, and I think that is the worst. I'm sympathetic to the views across this table, I'm sure, in thinking that those are the most terrible, the most disastrous outcomes for the economy and consequently also, for financial markets. I would say that on the tax cut and grow, we've done a lot of research on this in our group, and there's a lot of great academic research that's been done in the last 5 to 10 years as well. It's tricky. It's tricky business, and I thought I would just sort of walk through a textbook outline of why it's tricky, because in the public debate, I think this gets lost too often. There are very few people trying to clarify it seems to me. But on the one hand, debt to GDP is a negative for growth, right? I mean, empirical research shows pretty convincingly that the higher the debt to GDP ratio, the lower the future growth. And why that's true, I think, is due to a number of reasons. Professor Meltzer mentioned that the anticipated tax hikes, which I think is correct. I think in the current environment, you have to be worried about some of the sudden stop, the rollover concerns, which, you wouldn't have worried about 10 years ago, but now watching the horror of Europe play out before our eyes, you realize this is not a hypothetical question. This is a real live danger. And the higher your debt to GDP ratio, the more the market will question your ability and, most importantly, your willingness to pay that debt back. And the more you're at a risk of having the market change its mind. And it happens. It can go, quite happy for a long, long time. It's gone 20 years in the case of Japan without worrying about debt rolling over, not being able to roll over. But suddenly, I find myself in conversations with macro hedge funds who are starting to ask that question. They're trying to think about it. They've been trying to think about it. So this is not a problem that can be ignored or hope to go away, and nor is it a problem any longer that is secondary to the problem of getting out of the recession. I think it is the problem that's front and center. And when you ask me why do I have confidence? When clients ask me why do you have confidence that eventually the political system will find a way to raise a little bit of tax revenue, and cut the rate of expenditure growth, because that's really what we're talking about. It's not that if you read through the Simpson-Bowles report or the CBO's stuff, which I have a copy in here, I was reading it in the plane. The solutions are not that complicated. They're basic math. If we could curtail the growth of medical spending in particular, we would go a long way towards, I think, addressing the concerns that the market is likely to have. And if we could complement that with more and a better tax system, I think, closing loopholes, sort of increasing the perceptions of fairness, as well as maybe increasing some revenue in places where it makes sense to do it, I think that would all be to the good. And I think the existing confidence in the system would become even greater. I do worry that we're not there yet in terms of that consensus. We seem to be crawling there, but time is not infinite in this process. Again, as the painful example of Europe shows. But I do think when you survey, ultimately, so why do I think it's a good bet that the U.S. political system will do the right thing? I think it's a good bet because it's a popular issue. It resonates with voters. And ultimately, that's when you examine sovereign risk and you ask, what are the circumstances that give rise to the market deciding I don't want to roll that debt. I'd actually just soon put my money somewhere else. What are the factors that sort of lead up and precipitate that kind of change of heart of the market? The answer is the market looks at that economy, looks at that government, looks at the taxpayers and the voters in that economy, and decides that economy is not willing to pay me back, and so I'm not willing to roll over my loan. And if you ask why is it that Japan can persist as long as it has with the highest debt to GDP ratio in the world, the answer is because everybody thinks that the Japanese society is good for their word, that the Japanese will not want to default on that debt, whether it's because of their desire to maintain their political capital with the debt markets, or whether it's just a matter of national pride or culture or all the above. That's what the market believes. If you look at a sovereign country like Greece and you ask that same question, we've seen now repeatedly what people believe. Or if you look at Argentina and the way they treat their foreign investors, everybody knows the answer to that question. So I think it makes a big difference how sovereigns treat their lenders, and lenders in turn, when they're trying to decide whether to continue lending, look very much at the willingness of a country to pay back debt. So I think, when I listen to, the political campaign, when I even look at, the current administration, which has not been branded and has not attempted to brand it itself as a fiscally responsible administration, they talk a fiscally responsible game. And just as an observer of that, my impression of that is that they believe it resonates with voters, and that's why they continue to say such things, even if they don't necessarily walk the walk. They're at least willing they at least understand that they need to talk. But that's ultimately saying that that's what voters care about. And so if you ask me, do I think that the national debt problem will be dealt with with just a complicated, inelegant combination of a kitchen sink of solutions of the sort that the Simpson-Bowles Commission, recommended many years ago now? The answer is yes, because eventually I think that Americans like to think of themselves as fiscally responsible. When I look at Europe, I don't have that same conviction, right? When you look at public sentiment surveys, and there are many, right, that ask the public about their sense of fairness and about the importance of the role of government versus the role of private enterprise, and questions that essentially get at questions like the sense of entitlement, right? Is it are you entitled to good health care? Are you entitled to retirement? Are you entitled to these things? By 2-to-1 margins, Europeans answer we're entitled, right? Don't ask me. I'm not a social scientist. I don't know where it comes from. But that is how they answer those questions, and God bless America. That is not how Americans think. That's my view. Americans still very much feel like they are responsible. I think for their own fate. That's a sentiment that's evolved over time. But I still think relative to the rest of the countries in the world, save possibly Japan, the United States is an economy where I think the voters still are very enamored of the idea that you're supposed to live within your means. So I do think that we will tax cut and eventually grow our way out of the debt to GDP ratio. Now, if you look historically and ask how have we gotten out of this fix in the past, right? We're not yet at World War II levels, but we're close. We're at debt to GDP ratios that are in the 70 to 80% range. After World War II, they exceeded 100%. So how did we get out of that? And the answer is really twofold. There's a lot of academic research on this, and our economists have looked at this as well. But basically, you can divide the last 50 years into two parts. The first part, there was some early inflation in the 40s, the immediate aftermath of the war, that pretty good dent and got that ratio, I think, to just below 100. And then for several years, real interest rates were negative up until roughly the Volcker Fed. And essentially, if you're borrowing at negative interest rates, that's not a very complicated math problem. Your debt obligations are going to go down, not up, as long as you're not adding to the problem any faster than you're getting the benefit of negative rates. And I'd say if you can sort of do an accounting decomposition into how much of it was real rates, which is kind of a combination of inflation and the nominal interest rate. Sort of working out so that you get a negative real rate, and how much of it was growth, which is the idea that if you don't grow your spending and your economy grows, you get that sort of natural reduction of the debt ratio over GDP. The answer is the bulk of it was negative real rates. If you look at the period post-'80, it's been the other way around, right? So real interest rates were very high during the 80s, and they stayed relatively high during the 90s, and it's only recently that they've gone negative again. But over the last 30 years, really, it was primary surpluses and growth that did the heavy lifting, not negative interest rates. And so those are different ways to skin the cat. I think if you ask me, I'm as long as the political environment doesn't radically change, and you can never say never. Again, just ask any European. You can never say never. I think that I have huge confidence, and the market has huge confidence that the Fed is a committed, stable inflation institution, and everybody in my generation, is a hardcore inflation fighter. I think at heart, that could always change 30 years down the road. In my mind, and I want to use this to segue to the second theme of my comments, which is incentives. I think the reason that I'm such a firm advocate of what the Fed is trying to do is not just because it sort of fits the facts. You can say, well, they're falling short of the inflation mandate. That's true. They're falling short of the unemployment mandate. That's true. But you might still worry that the market at some point, because all that debt is on the balance sheet, will just change its mind and freak out, and inflation expectations will become unanchored in contrast to the way they are today, and that we'll find ourselves in a sort of a self-fulfilling spiral of higher inflation and higher money growth. I think, but there are offsetting concerns. So that's a concern. I think is a tiny risk. There's an offsetting concern that I have, which is the risk of doing too little, and it's a conservative concern with a small c, in the sense that the risk of doing too little is that the economy goes off the tracks, and I have very much in mind the European template in mind here. The economy goes off the tracks. The political support for the existing set of institutions in the economy and the existing political regime and the existing economic regime goes off the tracks. And you sow the seeds, for black swans, so to speak, just to mix a metaphor, that are hard to anticipate, right? So I think Europe is a great example of that, because the European, monetary union was meant to kind of glue together a bunch of sovereigns, which in many cases had very little common economic design elements that are desirable in a currency union, and yet the belief was if we just glue them together under this this patriotic banner of a common currency, well then the politics will follow, and that sort of common European sentiment will eventually grow, and we'll eventually have common financial regulation, we'll have banking union, we'll have fiscal union, we'll eventually have a European tax, we'll have all the things that economists everywhere around the world were warning, you need to have a successful common currency, otherwise you're just asking for heartache. And that advice, I think, was pretty roundly ignored. And now we're seeing that not only is the common currency failing for all the predictable reasons that every macroeconomist thought it would fail, it's doing worse than that. It's actually failing the political mission, right? Because now you have riots in the street of Portugal. You have riots in the streets of Greece. You have anti-German sentiment all across the periphery. You have anti-periphery sentiment in Germany, and none of this has yet reached a point where I think it's a threat to the European monetary experiment. But if it doesn't reverse, it's an obvious threat, right? It's a no-brainer threat, in my opinion. So I think the ECB has bought time through some monetization for that political agenda to get on course, but so far there's very little evidence of it. And so what I think is really the point I want to make with that is that I think solving backwards from incentives is what both policy and regulation are high risk of doing too little of, right? So you should have been able to anticipate, I'll just first use the case of Europe, that if you built a currency union where the conditions were not in place and you failed to get the political convergence and the fiscal convergence, that the currency union itself would become a huge source of tension, just like it was for the first time around in Europe in the early 90s when George Soros attacked the pound, and there was tension between what the UK wanted and what continental Europe wanted. In the same way, it should have been obvious that those economic tensions would lead to political tensions and be counterproductive to what the political agenda was in the first place. Some other examples, and again, I think on the case for monetary hawks, my point is, my pushback is always, and I'm surrounded by a lot of them in the fixed income market, who worry nothing if they don't worry about nothing if they don't worry about inflation. I always say, well, the risk is that you do too little. Not only does and so you end up not only with deflation, but you end up with a whole new political monetary regime, right? Which would be a lot less friendly to your anti-inflation desires than the current Bernanke, probably to be followed by Yellen or similar-minded central banker. And I think the current regime is manifestly anti-inflation and for stable growth and stable inflation. I think that's the regime we rode in on, and that's the one we want to ride out with. We don't want to do anything that you wouldn't want to see policymakers do anything that jeopardizes the consensus that the current regime is in fact the best one. I think that's possible to have. So I do think there's a risk of doing too little. And then my biggest concern is that not that macro policy will fail, although again, because I think the period during which the U.S. becomes experimentally aggressive with monetary policy is probably mostly behind us. We're just going to kind of run it off from here. And the experimentally aggressive fiscal policy, I think, is also behind us. We're now in the cleanup stage. Where I think where the risk is still high, in my opinion, and I'm sort of talking my book here as a banker, I think there's still a huge risk that financial regulation is going to overreach. And here I think paying more attention to incentives as opposed to command and control is a huge issue. And I'm just going to pick an issue that Professor Meltzer mentioned, not because I disagree so strenuously, but just because it happens to be an issue I've thought a lot about and worked on in my day job. So the question of bank capital for the banks is one that I would say, broadly speaking, I agree with. Like, and the big problem in the banking sector is, there's an incentive problem created by government in the first place, which is that you provide deposit insurance. You provide the short-term funding, which is sort of guaranteed. And so if I can borrow short, guaranteed, no risk that I can't roll it over, and I can invest long, Why wouldn't you do that all day long? Why wouldn't you lever that as much as you can? So you've created an incentive for leverage that normal banks, if they're playing with their own money, don't have. No, normal banks care about living to fight again tomorrow. They care about managing their default risk. But if you've got guaranteed deposits or any kind of guaranteed liquidity more generally, like access to a lender of last resort, your incentive is to take that franchise and lever it. So I do think there's a critically important role for regulating capital, which is as a counterbalance to that incentive to take risk. And I'll go further and say something, that you don't hear a lot from bankers on the street, but it's also important to regulate risk taking, right? As Al Volcker, as much as I think Dodd-Frank is a very mediocre bill, and I'm being as polite as I can in a polite company. The spirit of a lot of what it's trying to do is correct, right? I think it's the way that it's going about it that's wrong. But the spirit of trying to regulate risk-taking, regulate leverage, given that you've guaranteed, in the case of bank deposits or the lender access to the discount window, you've guaranteed access to short-term funding, you need to offset that risk and the incentives that creates. And then I make the similar point in the mortgage market, right? Given that you guaranteed mortgage risk, you guaranteed it. You said, you're never going to suffer a credit loss in the mortgage market. And guess what happened? The market took that guarantee and ran as hard and fast as it could, levered it, took as much risk, monetized the subsidy that government provided to the greatest extent possible. So, again, I'm not going to argue that I think either the window of last resort or mortgage insurance by the government is necessarily a bad idea. I'm just going to point out that it creates bad incentives. And regulation, in my opinion, should be designed with very, very thoughtfully with those negative incentives in mind. So let me take the example of bank equity capital to illustrate what I have in mind. So one approach is to ask the banks to hold more capital, and that's already, Basel III already does that. We're going to hold dramatically more capital than we held, twice as much, more than twice in some cases, than we held pre-crisis. There are proposals, in discussion to increase that further still. I think the problem I have with that is it doesn't recognize some of the recapitalization structures. So, I would say that most of the banks that got in trouble, there were some banks that had a lot of short-term liabilities, and those were overwhelmingly, I think, banks that had access to the discount window. There were other banks that had a lot of short-term assets, had a lot of liquidity, because they knew they didn't have access to the discount window, and so they were self-insuring to a degree that they didn't have access to the window. And I think if you have, so that's one option would be to go that way. It would be to sort of curtail access to discount window. But the other alternative is to curtail the leverage incentives, right? So if you're going to keep short-term funding incentives in place, and you know that creates over-leveraged incentives, why not mitigate the leverage incentives? Instead, in one way is to just mandate equity capital, but a problem with mandating it is that bankers are clever and lawyers are clever people, and many of you are clever people, and someday you'll be cleverly trying to figure out ways to squeeze leverage out of the regulations. An alternative is to put capital structures in place that say, and I'm thinking here of contingent capital, which I'm a huge fan, if your debt ratios fall, rise above a certain level, in other words, your equity falls below a certain threshold, we're going to automatically convert some of your debt to equity. And we're going to do it in such a way that your equity is going to be diluted. So you're going to want to avoid that happening. So the cost to you, incentive-wise, of leveraging your short-term funding guarantee is that you may actually dilute, dramatically your equity holding in the firm as part of the management team. So I think getting those types of incentives right is just critically important, and I can talk all night if anybody wants to hang out or quiz me afterwards on this particular topic. I would go further and say that the incentives that there are macro incentives at risk here as well, and Professor Meltzer alluded to these, but I think the incentive to inflate once you've got a high debt to GDP is very high, but there's a counterpart to that. You can't just inflate, right? Because the minute the market suspects you're going to inflate, interest rates are going to rise, and then you're going to be rolling over your debt at higher rates, and so the interest burden of the debt is going to go up, and your debt to GDP ratio is either going to hold constant or worse. If the market's trying to think one step ahead, it's actually going to deteriorate faster than you could inflate the debt away. So if the market's onto your game, it doesn't work. And I think that's why we were able to inflate parts of the debt away in the first half of the last 50 years. But it's worse than that, because once the market figures out, so what happens in emerging markets, right? Once the market figures out, once the policymakers figure out that the market has figured out the game, they put more regulation on the financial sector and say, you can't actually move your bank out of the, look what happened in Cyprus, right? You can't move your money offshore. You have to leave it in the bank. Why? Because we're going to tax it with inflation. That's why. But it has all kind of, we had interest rate caps on the interest that the banks could pay on deposits. We had all kinds of constraints on the financial system. In Europe, there's serious discussion of a financial transaction tax going on today, which in my opinion is has a too high risk of actually making it into law, which would essentially shut down public debt markets. And why? Because public debt markets are global markets. They can abandon a country that pursues poor policies. I think a lot of these countries know they're going to be, they're sort of doomed to pursue poor policies, and so they're anxious and shutting down public debt markets. That will put it back inside the banking system, which then these sovereign countries can regulate more aggressively. But why does any sovereign want to keep capital in the banking system where the regulators can keep it in the country? Because they want to tax it. And that, broadly speaking, that whole process of regulating capital and savings of households so that it can't leave an economy and so it can be taxed is a form of financial repression, which I think we're at much higher risk of than we realize. And again, I mentioned that as an incentive. It's in the incentives of policymakers to pursue and regulators to pursue those kinds of policies. This idea for the financial transaction tax in Europe is coming out of European Commission. European Commission is a toothless tiger. It knows that. It needs tax revenue. It knows that it also needs a way to keep capital inside Europe, because on the path they're going, capital will be abandoning Europe, I think, at an increasingly high rate. So it's a little bit of a stretch I think to tie all, to use a thread to tie all these incentive issues together. But I have to say, as an economist, there's like smart macro theory, and it's just like leveraging the historical relations in the world. But that always goes wrong, and really when I talk to to lawyers, and I'm mindful of the audience, when I think of like the design of regulation, I think too often the idea is, here's a problem, let's write a rule that just addresses that problem. We're just going to say that thing can't be done anymore, and that will fix the problem. But the incentives are enormous, right? The incentives in the market to work around rules are endless, and the street never sleeps. And I think if you don't design rules so that the street is forced to eat its own cooking, so to speak, so the investors in the markets are forced to live with the consequences of their actions, then I think you get bad outcomes. And as I say, there are rules in place that kind of get half of this right, they get half of it wrong. There are rules that, for example, prevent the Fed from bailing out banks. That's kind of good. Except you still got the incentives. They still know they might have the discount window, and so they're still going to be leveraging. They're still going to be taking long risk, funded short. And I think as long as you have the ingredients for that kind of crisis in place, and then you've tied your hands from addressing the crisis, you've made a bad problem worse, right? I think you need to go back to the core, address the core problems, and again, sort of thinking about the incentives that face market participants in a balanced way is ultimately going to be key here. I'll stop there because I think you're standing there to make me stop. Okay.
Thank you, Charles. And Steve? Okay, let's open up the conversation for the panelists among themselves, including Alan.
I agree with a lot of what Charles said, but let me concentrate on some of the things where it might be worth having more discussion. We've been here many times before. World War II, he mentioned, but we also paid down the Civil War debt, the War of 1812 debt, the World War I debt. So we know how these things can be made to work. The World War I debt is a very interesting way we paid it down. It was a big debt for the time. We had a Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon, who ran a surplus in his budget. reduce tax rates, and pay down the debt. Simple as that. You know, there's no reason why that can't work if we would let it. So my view, and the World War II problem is he discussed, and I don't basically disagree very much with what he said about that. A little bit of inflation, negative interest rates. We have negative interest rates now. Growth. How likely are we want to ask, to get back on that path now? Boy, inflation, that seems like a good bet. All the banks, the central banks of the world, are printing money as if it were tissue paper. That there's never been a time, never, when we had that kind of activity and it didn't end up with some inflation. Hopefully not huge, but we'll see. I'd like to comment on what he said about the lender of last resort, because there has to be a lender of last resort. The reason we have to have it is because there are unanticipated shocks that come all the time. Things happen that you had no way to predict that they were going to happen. No one, at least, anticipated the current crisis or its severity. No one anticipated that the European Union was going. Many people knew, including most of the Europeans, central bankers, that a European Union without a fiscal restraint, without a banking policy, was not very well designed. They knew that. The reason they agreed to the system they had, there's an excellent book just written by an economic historian at Princeton, which describes the way in which that was put together. And I had some personal involvement with that experience. But Chancellor Kohl believed that he had to make a deal because he was going to prevent Europe from having a future war. We met once in Bonn, and he was giving a keynote address in the evening, and I was giving it in the morning. And so he came to me and said, "You're an American economist, you don't like the euro." And I said, "The euro is a political decision, but the economics will decide whether it works." That turns out to be correct. The economics was not right because he never worried. His closest advisors have told me he never thought about economics. He thought about politics. He wanted to avoid a future European war. He knew that to do that he had to tie France and Germany together. You can't fault him for that. That certainly was a noble and worthwhile thing. What you can fault him for was accepting a plan that the Bundesbank, the German central bank, and many others knew was flawed. And the flaws have come to life. You need a lender of last resort in the system because there are unanticipated events. Walter Bagehot, the editor of The Economist, way back in 1873, explained how to organize the lender of last resort. And when the British did that, they didn't have banking crises. That is, they managed their banking crises without doing bailouts. What did Bagehot say? He didn't criticize the Bank of England for not doing the right thing. He criticized the Bank of England for not announcing in advance what its policy was. It didn't tell people what it would do in the event of a crisis. The Federal Reserve is 100 years old. They have never announced their lender of last resort policy. Not now, not before, never. Why not? Well, because they want to retain flexibility. That's a big mistake. If they announce that they have a lender of last resort policy and they say, look, what Bagehot said was lend freely on collateral at a penalty rate. Now that has effects which are very important and which are important to understand. It forces people who want to be saved to hold collateral. It means that they're going to have assets which they can sell to the central bank if they get into a crisis. So as the crisis begins to appear more or less likely, they're going to try to load up on those assets that they can sell to the central bank. Second, it keeps them, it tells them, look, there's a place where you can go to protect yourself. You don't need to go to Congress and try to get a bailout. You can come to us and sell your assets, and that's going to be a better system. So you want to have a clear understanding about what you want to do, and like all rules, you want to enforce it when the time comes. That is badly needed in our system. There will be, in the next couple of weeks, a bipartisan announcement of a Democrat and a Republican senator on capital requirements, which will, Charles, raise the capital requirements. Why do I want to raise capital requirements? Because you'll hear the bankers scream, but that's not my object in life. I don't care whether they are unhappy, but I don't think that that should deter Congress, hopefully, from doing the right thing. Why you want, from 1929 to 1932, the worst period in American banking history or in anybody's banking history, no large bank in the United States failed. Not a single one. They didn't have a lot of regulations. They didn't have somebody looking over their shoulder and telling them what they could lend on. They had equity capital. They knew that if you take a risk, you take the risk. So they were careful.
They did not have credit default swaps, and I don't believe they had exotic derivatives. One of the things this crisis taught us is no amount of equity will save a bank that is swamped when it makes a bad bet on a credit default swap. That is 6 or 7 times.
Think about that the other way. If the bank knows that it's not going to get bailed out, it doesn't have hundreds of millions of dollars of credit default swaps. It relates what it has on its asset portfolio to what risks it wants to take. What the banks did under FDIC and regulation was to reduce their capital requirements from the 15 to 20% that they had then down to 5 or 6%. But it wasn't really 5 or 6% because they got permission to use bonds in their capital, in their requirements, and they insured the bonds. So they had no skin in the game practically. They took risks onto their balance sheet, but they were not risks which they were going to pay for if they turned out wrong. That's how we get into trouble. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, and some others had examiners in every major bank in the United States before the crisis, long before the crisis. They examined the assets that were being purchased and the credit default swaps that they were doing, and they did not complain against a single transaction. Not one. That tells you something about regulation. It tells you there's judgment involved in all of those things, and you say that's a risky asset. And Jamie Dimon says, look, I've been a banker for a lot longer than you have, and I don't think that's a risk.
He lost $1 billion, was it last quarter or 2 quarters ago, where they were playing in international markets. Nobody knows those risks until they collapse.
Correct.
I agree the regulators don't know it, but I'm not sure the bankers, even the most brilliant bankers.
So what you want them to do is to know that if they take big risks, they want to have a cushion. Nobody knows how big the risks are going to be before they occur. That's quite right. You and I agree, right? What you want to do is change the incentives that the bankers have to undertake risks which may lead them to fail. And that's why you want to have a lender of last resort, and you want to get them to hold conservative portfolios.
Yeah. Alan, I think that a challenge we're going to see for the future, and the recent crisis was just a glimmer of it, is that as financial products get much more complicated, which is inevitable, a lot of people will not fully understand them or their ramifications. And to go back to the incentive issues, which we all agree on, part of the problem I think, is that with very complicated products, the people who understand them are the technical people, the VPs, the analysts, not necessarily the people at the very top who make the ultimate decisions about their institutions. Take an example of VAR, value at risk, where you have a technical way, a mathematical phraseology of risk, and it's very possible that a lot of the VPs and such understood what the risks, or at least had a sense of what the risks were, but the VAR computation showed the risk was zero. And from the standpoint of the directors, the top managers, they thought that their institutions were engaging in high return, very low risk transactions. And I think we need to try to harmonize those incentives as
Where
part
you
of
and I
any-
disagree
Okay.
is you take the fact that there are going to be credit default swaps and people are going to load up on those as being sort of a given, and I don't. I believe that what you do, that all bankers are not foolish. Some are, some aren't. Citigroup probably failed 3 different times, got bailed out. J.P. Morgan Chase went through that crisis, the most recent crisis. They paid for their losses. They had the capital to pay for their losses. Many banks lost money in the 70s when the Latin American countries failed. But not all bankers were heavily invested in Latin America. Some made judgments that they didn't want to be there. What we need to do, we're not going to find perfection. We're going to find better. And what better it means is we're going to give people more incentive to be more judicious, to think more about, do I really want to do that? That's really where the cutting edge of this is.
Well, I think, I'm sorry, please.
Period.
Okay, so I was going to say
We
that
should wrap up in a second.
I think that we focus on banks. With shadow banking system, a lot of the players are no longer the banks per se. A lot of the key systemic triggers again are also markets, and I think ultimately at the end of the day there are going to be problems of all sorts, and we're not going to be able to prevent them. And we need to also think about not just ex ante preventive regulation, but also ex post regulation that addresses the consequences.
Great. Let's open up the conversation to the audience at large. Again, let me insist that you limit your comments to questions, not observations or otherwise. And we'll take 3 questions and then let our panelists decide how they want to respond or not respond. Here in the front. Let's take a question in the back as well, at the far back there, yeah.
My question is, has the FDIC's insurance and deposits outlook? You talked about incentives.
I'm sorry, would you repeat it?
Yes. Has the FDIC's insurance of deposits outlook and usefulness, is that needed in
And one last question there.
The other thing is, a lot of you talking about how there's a lot of debt we can't keep spending. I'd say a good example would be like our infrastructure. Our infrastructure is really crumbling and it's pretty bad. So wouldn't it be better to borrow the money now while lending costs are really low and inflation is still, unemployment is still relatively high, where we will employ more people, the lending costs are lower, the interest rates, and it'll be easier to pay off. And there's some deflationary pressure from other places like Europe that are starting to collapse. So I guess in a nutshell, wouldn't it be better to borrow the money, pay for the infrastructure now rather than when the economy is
Okay. Panelists?
Let me very quickly respond on the first 2, and others may, and defer on the third, which is more of a macroeconomic issue. On the Warren Buffett idea, various regulations have tried to put on the very senior executive these responsibilities. But I think that the experience is that the senior executives are not only, they do not fully understand in many cases I mean, take the Enron. I've done extensive study of Enron. The senior executives did not fully appreciate that except for Fastow, and he had a conflict. In the case, as I mentioned, of the recent financial crisis, you had all these other conflicts. So you can penalize the senior executives, but that will not necessarily change, that will not go the entire way, and it may discourage good people from acting as senior executives. I think you need to align all the incentives at all the levels within the firm, that operate. You also need to, I think, internalize externalities, and part of the problem is that firms really have inbuilt incentives to engage in risky transactions which have a high probability return, even though there's a very low probability the firm will fail, because on a present value basis, that's actually positive. A lot of the harm is actually externalized onto Main Street, and we need to know how to deal with that, and there are various potential ways to do that. On the FDIC insurance, I mean, the problem you have, of course, is the potential for the bank run, and the FDIC insurance mitigates that problem. Now, I'll compare that. I recently have a paper called Ring Fencing, where I, among other things, compare the U.S. banking system and the UK banking system. The UK banking system does not have federal deposit or government deposit insurance, has an option of private deposit insurance, but it's imperfect. And for this reason, that's one of the reasons that the Vickers report of the Independent Commission on Banking in the UK recommends retail ring fencing, and why that may be more appropriate for UK banks than US banks, because it would help to mitigate the run on the bank. But you need to address the run of the bank problem because that is a market failure.
Charles, any thoughts?
Yeah, quick. So I do think that not just CEOs, but even mid-level staffers like myself suffer a ton if our firms default. I mean, I worry about it to such a degree that my wife says, "Seriously, we can't go out to eat tonight." And it's like during the crisis. And now I was fortunate that I had been an academic for 15 years, and my total financial assets consisted of a 401k, which was unfortunately in equities. But so I didn't have a lot of my wealth tied to Goldman Sachs at the time, but I do today. And if Goldman Sachs failed, most of my retirement plan would be gone, along with it. So. I have friends who had been on the street, during the prior 10 years, and they were wiped out, right? They start over. They start from scratch, and they save a lot because, most of their wealth was tied to the firm. And, increasingly, and I think it's not wrong that regulation, I don't know how much this is out in the public, but, a lot of the regulation the last few years has gone to great lengths. I can't take, the stock that I got paid, in January, which was most of my bonus, is I can't even touch it for 5 years, right? And most of it I won't be able to cash for 7 years if it, hopefully if it still has value. So my wealth is pretty meaningfully tied up, and it's even more so tied up for senior executives. So I think, I think that's a good thing. I'm preaching incentives that I want to eat my own cooking on that. I think it makes a huge difference if people have to live with the consequences of their risk decisions. And the reason I care so passionately about that is that I think risk-taking matters, right? Risk-taking built this country. It built the developed world, right? Without risk-taking, without R&D, without capital, without the commitment of capital, without the efficient allocation of capital, it just doesn't exist. It doesn't happen by magic, right? Like real capitalist heroes took big risks, like Warren Buffett, right, and made efficiency increasing decisions that we all benefit from, and I think the risk to me of not going down a road that is private sector, market focused, and incentive, sensitive. And instead of doing a ham-handed command and control, which I'm quite confident is what the European approach is probably going to pursue, I think you really there's a risk that you destroy your seed corn, as Alan mentioned in his opening remarks. You have to be investing in capital that has a marginal product that exceeds the value of the capital you're putting in. And if the financial system isn't functioning, that's the genius of America. Why I saw an article today on the plane. It was saying like 40% of all tech startups are foreign-born. And why does every foreign, smart, well-educated entrepreneur want to come to this country and start their job-creating companies in this country? It's because they can take risks. They can be funded. They can be reassured that they're going to get to be able to keep the returns from their investment. There's a Silicon Valley that will help them, that will guide them, that will provide capital. There are public equity markets that they'll be able to cash out into if they become a really successful company. There are public debt markets that are deep and liquid that they'll be able to scale, increase the scale of their productivity-enhancing ideas. So risk-taking, capital allocation, these are huge. I mean, if you don't believe it, travel in sub-Saharan Africa. My best friend from college was a missionary in Tanzania, and I once spent a couple months there. And I remember the priest in the town said, I was talking to him once one evening, and because that's what you do all the time, sit around and talk. And I asked him, I said, like, what do people do for banking and financial services here? And it was almost a joke question because it was a dirt hut town. But he said there is no banks. They're government banks, but nobody will trust the banks. Nobody will put their money there. And I was thinking, well, that just means there's no capital formation because there's no household savings because nobody can get a return on savings. And he said, if I opened a bank, I'd be flooded with deposits because everybody would trust me because I'm a trustworthy institution. But he said there are no such institutions in the economy. And to me, that only made an impact on me because Tanzania that year, it was 1993, had a per capita GDP of $125. And I thought, here's the difference between countries that invest in capital and innovation and grow and eventually become wealthy, developed economies and societies and those that don't, right? You need somehow to foster the efficient allocation of capital. So I think risk-taking is at the heart of it, and I think the problem with regulatory reform that doesn't balance the need for authentic risk-taking and what I would call gaming, public insurance schemes is that it will throw out the baby with the bathwater, right? On FDIC insurance, on the topic, I think FDIC insurance is valuable. I think bank runs are a real problem, as Professor Meltzer mentioned. But I would just have simple banks. I mean, I think if you have insured deposits, you should have greatly restricted assets. And so, there's room. There are lots of different kinds of financial institutions, and I don't think that big risk-taking institutions should be deposit-taking. So the separation of banking and it's called investment banking, commercial banking, investment banking, per se doesn't make a lot of sense unless you say, oh, well, commercial banking, we're going to define that to be deposit-taking. If you're taking, deposits insured with, public money, well, then, yeah, you should just be doing the plainest vanilla kind of risk-taking available. And then to the last question on infrastructure, absolutely. Like that, just to tie it back to the question on the pamphlet here. I mean, growth is going to be key to getting out from under the debt to GDP. The only painless way out, right? The only remote hope we have of a painless way out of this is to grow. And if we had spent $1 trillion on infrastructure, or a plan to spend it on infrastructure over 10 years instead of just reallocating it for future generations to pay back, we'd be in a much better debt to GDP, kind of a outlook because we'd be looking forward to the marginal product of all that capital. But as it is, we're on the hook for that as well now.
Thank you, Charles. Let's wrap up with a final comment by Alan.
It's only a few years, as these things go, that Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley were partnerships. So what changes when Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley become corporations? Well, it's true, as Charles said, that their employees are given stock options, and so they're heavily invested in the corporation, but not as heavily invested as they would have been if they were a partnership. When they were partnerships, their money was on the line. That changes their attitudes to a degree about risks. Would it be a good thing for them to be partners? I think so, but I'm willing to listen to argument on that. Do we need the FDIC? One of the things that, let me say finally, one of the reasons the investment banks took big risks was that the SEC lowered their capital requirements so they could leverage them by 30% to 1. That's idiocy. No one can live and take risks when they have that much leverage. That's an invitation to the kind of mess we got into. Is the FDIC still needed? Well, there's always moral hazard. It's not well known, but Franklin Roosevelt, who was president at the time that they passed the FDIC, pointed out there would be moral hazard, and he was against it. But Congress passed it overwhelmingly, and so we got the FDIC. At that time had a $2,500 limit on how much it would insure. If you multiply that by the inflation rate, that would bring you up to somewhere between $25,000 and $40,000 today. But we're way above that. So we were over-insuring large deposits. Should we get rid of that? Close to the idea of why we have an FDIC, of what we have as a result of the FDIC, is we have every Tom, Dick, Harry, Susan, Catherine, and Jane with a bank account. You don't have to monitor the bank because there's an FDIC. Do you want to go back to a system where each individual has to worry about the bank and where there are going to be bank runs which put the bank out of business? Now, when we have a bank run, they run from one bank to another. They didn't do that in 1930 or earlier periods. So that's the price we pay for having a financial system that services the entire community. I think we want to keep that. Last, on risk, Switzerland has decided that its banks are going to hold 19% equity capital. That's great. They worry about the fact that the banks are bigger than the country. If the banks fail, what happens to the country? They don't want to think through to the answer to that question, so they said, let's just make sure they don't get to be quite that big. And that's had an effect. What happened? Well, one of the great advantages that the Swiss have is that they're a safe place for people to put their money. So they have huge amounts of managed money from all over the world. All African dictators kept their money in Switzerland. They sure didn't put them under their own control. They knew better than that. They put them in Switzerland, where they didn't get big returns, but they got safety. So that's what the Swiss are emphasizing now, the big Swiss banks. On infrastructure, sure, we sure need infrastructure improvements all over this country. Should we do them now when interest rates are low? What that says is borrowing, think about borrowing the way I think about borrowing. It's a question of whether you want to tax today or tax tomorrow. Both have effects. If you're going to increase infrastructure, you're hanging out a sign that says taxes have to go up in the future. Is that something you want to do now? It's not something I want to do now. I want to solve the problems that we have without making them bigger. It's hard enough to get some way of thinking about getting to a solution without making the problem bigger and bigger all the time. The easiest thing to do is to say, let's spend more. Believe me, the Congress, there are even the most conservative members of Congress, possible a few exceptions, think that's a great idea, if it helps my district. But that's not what the public interest is. The public interest now is in answering the question that this symposium poses, solving the problems we have. Can we do that? Well, we can't do it quickly, and we're not likely to do it completely. I think the best that we can hope for is that we'll get a solution that moves the can down the road 30 years, and so you will have to face it again at some future time, but that we will relieve the problem for the next 15, 20, 30 years. That would be, I believe, the best that we're likely to get.
Thank you, Alan and Steve and Charles. What a wonderful, lively, and spirited exchange we've had this afternoon. And some of our guests may have time to stay over if others have questions for informally after the panel. But for the moment, let me just ask you join me in thanking our distinguished speakers.